Do we have a chairman?
Got a few minutes. Another 3 minutes.
Okay. God, packed already, Anne. Sometimes when I sat and there was, you know, the desks that are in there, and I'll come out to the loo and there's a committee meeting.
Need to see his face. I'm just trying to think where I know him from.
I think I've seen that for environment and police.
Because we have school parties coming as well.
Yeah.
And parties of
Because his dad is.
journalists.
Yeah.
Student journalists.
How's it going, old bean?
Still recovering from shocks.
Have you shown me?
I didn't go to Leslie's party on Sunday.
Journey? I didn't.
Cameron, how are you?
Good
Good to be back.
your office lost it or something? On the distribution.
I just sent a note to Megan to ask why she didn't print it out. I asked her to print everything and I drew her attention to the emails from Lucy, and I have just explored that with Will.
Yes.
Because it was an oversight that won't happen again.
Okay, I'm sure you will make sure it doesn't happen. Right, thank you.
It's a bit annoying.
At least it's cool in here. I just saw an email from someone.
Yeah, they wanted to Sky afterwards. London Live, Time FM, and somewhere else, and the other ones.
More capacity as chairman of budget.
Yeah. So it's all the other roads. Are we on time? I think we are on time. Ready? Okay, good morning everybody, good morning members, good morning guests. Welcome to the meeting. Can I ask everyone to check that their electronic devices are either off or on silent? And members of the public who may be watching the webcast, as well as the thronging crowds that are in the chamber today, you can follow us on @London Assembly on Twitter, and please use the hashtag police funding for this meeting. Do we have any apologies for absence?
Oh, none, Chairman.
No, none, okay. Item 2 is declarations of interest. The committee has recommended to note the list of offices held by Assembly members, and members are asked to declare any further disclosable pecuniary interests that aren't listed. Is there anything? Thank you, members. Item 3 is the membership of the committee. Those are set out in full. Item 4 refers to the terms of reference of the committee, and item 5 is the standing delegations. As set out in your order paper, are those agreed? Thank you very much. Takes us to the main item of business today, which is no, it doesn't. Item 8 is the main item of business. So we'll note the minutes of the previous meeting. Item 6. Are those agreed as a correct record?
Agreed.
Item 7 is the summary list of actions, and action taken under delegated authority by me. Are those noted?
Agreed.
Item 8 is the main item of business, which is relating to the funding of the Metropolitan Police Service. Can I welcome our guests today? Sophie Linden, the Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime. Siobhan Peters, the Chief Finance Officer at the Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime. Craig Mackey, who we know very well, normally at another committee. Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, and Linda McMullen, the Director of Finance from the Metropolitan Police. Thank you all very much for your time this morning. First couple of questions are mine, and the sort of opening questions really for Craig and for Sophie, which are quite open ones, which really is, do you have the necessary resources to keep London safe?
Do we have the necessary resources to keep London safe? I think probably it's clearly at the moment, in terms of the work we're doing and the work many members will have seen over the last 3 months, we've seen quite a change in the security situation in and around London. We've seen 3 attacks in the UK in the last 3 months, and that has put quite a lot of stretch into the systems in terms of what we do. And it's important that's not just stretch in our counter-terrorism command, that's stretch across policing as a system. Members will be aware that, you know, wherever you are, whichever borough you're working in the Met, at some point you've provided resources for and supported this. So we have the resources to cope with what we're doing at the moment. I think, as the Commissioner has said, clearly in light of what we're seeing at the moment, we need to work through collectively, is this the new norm? And if that is the case, what are the resources we would need if this is a new normal level of both threat to London? It also comes at a time where we've seen a tick upwards in the work around violent crime, and we've spoken quite a lot around the work we're doing around knife crime, and we've seen some rise in demand in terms of calls for service into the Met. So if you talk to, and I know many members do, talk to officers and staff out in boroughs, they feel quite hard-pressed at the moment. A lot of work and a lot of demand in the system. Now, in the true spirit of the Metropolitan Police and the true spirit of this city, they're coping incredibly well, but they are working incredibly hard to keep us in that position.
Deputy Mayor?
I think what I would add to what Craig's already said is that in terms of the Metropolitan Police Service, we are facing one of the really fundamental challenges around keeping the city safe, around counter-terrorism, but also around an increase in violence and an increase in crime. Those challenges are incredibly difficult, and on top of that, we are facing really, really significant budget challenges. You will know that the Met took £600 million out of the budget over the last 4 years. They're expected to take £400 million out of the budget in the next 4 years. And on top of that, we are facing a funding formula review that last time round could have imposed cuts of around 184 million to 700 million. And we're also underfunded on the national and international capital cities grants. These are really, really challenging times. We don't think the Met can take any more budget cuts and savings. And, you know, if the fundamental question is, does that challenge the security and safety of Londoners? We think it will if this continues, and we have to take police officer numbers out of the police service.
Yes, we've got questions that are going to explore all of those issues a bit further on. So thank you for your opening statements.
Yes. Can I just do a follow-up then?
Yes, Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. Obviously, there's been a number of cuts in other services that are not directly managed by the police, such as particularly the youth service. Do you feel that that has had any impact in terms of the increase that we've seen in the recent period on, for example, youth crime, in particular knife crime?
Gosh, that's a good question. I don't know if I could evidence that. So in the true strict sense of the word, if you said to me, you could produce the evidence for it, what we can see and what you, which happens at a much more local level, is there is some shunt of work. So you see where services have been reduced in some other parts of the public sector. The reality is, you know, ourselves, along with both the ambulance service and the fire service, are a 24-hour day, 365 days of the year service of last resort. You can always get hold of us. That's not the same with some other parts of the public sector. You might be put through to a helpline or something. You won't get to speak to a person. So we are seeing some things where work that would have previously been done elsewhere is flowing across to us. We don't have that in a sustained picture to say to you, there's the evidence, I'll make it up, we shut a youth service facility in Borough X, therefore crime's gone like that, and it's a direct correlation. Intuitively, I think people would say that. I couldn't produce the evidence for that.
I think the police service is like the canary in the mine, and it's often the first public service that really shows where things are going wrong. There has been, there's been reports around cuts in youth services. It has to have an impact on what is happening to young people in London. We know there's been significant challenges, not just to the police service and finances and budget, but across the public sector in London and nationally. It has to have had an impact. Policing is one element which can help us on tackling violence, but you have to have the services and the support there on early intervention, prevention and schooling. They are under significant pressure. It has to make a difference to what is happening on the streets.
Linda.
Just really to add to that, so given the very helpful piece of work you're doing around funding, I think these issues have specific impact on areas like London, where we are highly geared, so different reductions on different bits of those sort of services create quite a double whammy for those highly geared areas. And I think that's one of the things that we particularly want to look at in terms of some of our responses, in terms of how things are looked at in the future.
Okay. Before we move on to talk about the police and crime plan, Mr Mackey, there's been various media assertions that a reduction in the number of officers would have a direct impact on counter-terrorism. Is that a theory that you subscribe to?
Well, I think actually the message the police service is giving is slightly different, and I'll put it in a slightly different way. I think it's very challenging to see policing just as a group of discrete services. So if you look at counter-terrorism funding, it's usually ring-fenced, it's usually protected, but it requires the whole policing system to work. So one of the things that we've done in our work around the attack on Westminster, we know for every £1 we spent of counter-terrorism funding, we spent £2 of core money. So you have to spend that gearing to go with it. So if you say, well, it's all right, I've ring-fenced this particular budget, therefore that bit of the service is fine. That bit of the service and those discrete capabilities probably are. But if you need to mobilise large numbers of officers, if you need to mobilise firearms officers, other capabilities, you have to treat policing as a system. One of the dangers, I think, in the past is people go, well, I like that bit, I want that bit, and I'll ring-fence that bit. But if you don't understand how the system works, unfortunately, you end up then with gaps along the way. And there is no doubt, talking to colleagues, particularly outside London and other parts of the country, there are people who are feeling the stretch quite dramatically. As I said, here, the reality is when you talk to, and if you go to any of the boroughs that you represent and support, you'll find officers are finding it quite stretched.
So you do agree with that assertion then?
No, I agree with you've got to fund and support funding for that whole system. What you can't do, it's rather akin, forgive me my analogy, to funding just one part of the health service. I'll tell you what, I'll fund radiology and the service will be brilliant. Well, it will be around radiology, but the rest of it won't. You know, in the same way, policing is quite a complex system. You know, one of the things, if you look at some of the debriefs we've done around Westminster and the others, some of the things that work is just the ability to mobilise lots of people really, really quickly. That's not a protected area of funding. That's things like duties hubs, making sure they work, making sure the technology works. That's the stuff that makes the system work.
Yes, because the contrary argument to the assertion that I've just put to you would be that counter-terrorism is protected, therefore there's no increased threat of terrorism. But what you're saying is that actually neighbourhood policing, if that would be where the axe would cut, would have a knock-on effect right through the chain, including counter-terrorism.
Yeah, I'm absolutely keen. You've got to fund the whole system.
Okay. Going to move on and talk about the police and crime plan. And the first question is aimed at the Deputy Mayor. Could you outline the key objectives of the police and crime plan and how the Met intends to fund them?
Didn't quite catch the beginning.
Could you outline the key objectives of the police and crime plan and how the Met intends to fund them?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we've, in front of the Police and Crime Committee, we've taken a number of questions on this, but Police and Crime Plan looks to set the strategic direction for the Met and also to work with other partners around policing, yes, but crime reduction as well. So the Police and Crime Plan has central tenet around neighbourhood policing and the importance of reintroducing neighbourhood policing and the dedicated ward officers into every ward, an absolute priority in relation to dealing with lots of different crimes as well as counter-terrorism. And there's three key priorities around keeping children and young people safe. And yes, that is absolutely around tackling violence and tackling the increase in knife crime, but also looking at child protection and child abuse and child sexual exploitation. Second key priority is around violence against women and girls and looking at a commitment within the Police and Crime Plan is to refresh the violence against women and girls strategy to ensure that everybody's working together around tackling domestic violence, so-called honour-based crimes, female genital mutilation. The third key priority is around tackling hate crimes, standing up to intolerance and extremism. And we've seen in recent days an increase in hate crime and how important that priority is. Alongside that, alongside the Police and Crime Plan, we've set some London-wide priorities for in terms of performance around hate crime, knife crime, gun crime, and sexual abuse, and also been out to all the local authorities and the boroughs to discuss with them the setting of local priorities, and that has been done so that locally there has been an input into those crimes that matter most to the local boroughs, and that's the sort of the performance aspect of the Police and Crime Plan. during the development of the Police and Crime Plan, we worked with the Metropolitan Police very closely in developing that. So it wasn't, you know, and alongside that, they have been developing a policing plan, a business plan that sets, you know, is the delivery function of the Metropolitan Police and is very much set along the priorities of the Police and Crime Plan and how that will be delivered.
So within that, I mean, what you've outlined there are strategic priorities, and I think we get that. Have you assigned specific budgets to attaining those strategic priorities? Have you changed the way you're funding it?
So in terms of how we fund from MOPAC these strategic priorities, we have we have a lot of commissioning, and you know, we commission a lot of services via MOPAC. The London Crime Prevention Fund and the new way that that's been allocated across boroughs is allocated along the Police and Crime Plan priorities, and we have had a number of the allocations have come in for the Police and Crime Plan. I'm just looking up, you know, in terms of the amount of money that's going to the specific areas. So there's, thank you. So in terms of the tackling violence against women, about 20% of the commissioning budget in 2017-18 is going that in that direction, and that's the same for keeping children and young people safe, and a better criminal justice system, 39%. That London Crime Prevention Fund is one of the ways in which we have commissioned services, and the Metropolitan Police business plan is around allocating and prioritising the way that they deliver through their policing function around the Police and Crime Plan, and also, of course, the strategic policing responsibilities that they have around serious and organised crime as well. Okay.
Ms McMullen, the new Police and Crime Plan, does that have budgetary implications from your perspective?
So we've done some work to check through the alignment. So we have checked through to make sure that we've got adequate resources in those areas. I think just for clarity, the budget as agreed was agreed in advance of the Police and Crime Plan. What we're doing in terms of the planning that we've kicked off, I think the Deputy Mayor raised the business plan that we've developed. We're now going through the process with that Police and Crime Plan that maps into through the business plan that maps into the Police and Crime Plan to make sure that that drives our budgets for future years. So we've got a really sort of tight, a very sort of clear sort of golden thread through that. So while we've gone through the process to see and make sure that we've got that appropriate alignment in broad terms already, I think what we'll see in terms of the next sort of budgets is that much sort of closer tying together of those documents.
Okay, so how much leeway do you have within the budgetary arrangements around the Police and Crime Plan? And I'm specifically asking that question, excuse me, because we know that the police funding formula is under review, and we are anticipating the result, and obviously people are concerned that there might be some reductions. So if there were to be reductions, will the plan stand or will it have to change?
So the plans that we have got at the moment, so it's based on the assumptions that we have at the moment. So that's in terms of the existing funding arrangements, which are broadly cash neutral funding from government, assuming that council tax goes up by 2% and there's buoyancy in council tax of 2%, which drives the figure that the Deputy Mayor was talking about of about 400 million savings. So those are the plans that we're working to at the moment. On top of that, we are, in terms of the look ahead and planning, we are building in some assumptions around what that differential could be, so what those different scenarios may possibly be. So, for example, government is talking in terms for us departments to plan on the basis of up to 6% reductions in terms of a comprehensive spending review. That may be a lot less likely given sort of recent sort of events, and also what the funding formula could impact. So we're also looking at those sort of planning scenarios as well. So so while we don't want to assume that we will take a lot more sort of cuts within the sort of policing service, I don't think that's anything that we would want to see. We're certainly looking at what that impact would be in terms of our overall modelling. And therefore, what would those sort of choices then be to make sure that we keep that alignment and keep having those conversations about that prioritisation?
Okay, what kind of scenarios have you modelled so far?
So we're looking at scenarios up to an additional 6% reduction.
6%. And if it was a 6% reduction, what would be the implication?
That's what we're working through at the moment, just to make sure that we're absolutely clear. So in terms of how that would impact on policing and on Met, it wouldn't necessarily hit all in 1 year. So almost certainly the Home Office would agree some sort of transitional sort of arrangement for that to impact. So we are planning on those terms to see what that would mean for our models that we've been developing through One Met model. So we just need to understand what that sort of stretch is. It absolutely isn't to say that we think that's a good thing to do, or we think some of these things are even sort of possible in some sort of scenarios, but we really need to understand that sort of impact and do that sort of planning and just really test our models to make sure they're robust.
Okay. In the event of a funding reduction going forward, the Commissioner in a media interview said that the police may have to stop doing some things. What kind of things, Mr Mackey?
Well, there'll be a whole... potentially, there's a range of things. I think what the Commissioner was signalling there is if you get to some of the high-end modelling of examples of numbers people throw out, which are at the high end of sort of expectation of modelling, you can't have exactly the same service. You just... there's no way you can model that. So you have to look at what services you would deliver face-to-face, whether on certain types of crime you get a different level of service depending on the seriousness, severity of the threat, the risk and harm to the individual. All of that would need to be looked at. It's not as simple as saying, and we've had this debate in other committees a number of times, you know, I think I've put the challenge a couple of times, what would you like us to stop doing? And usually by the end of it all, people want more roads policing, more wildlife officers, more neighbourhood officers, more gangs teams, more... That's not the real world we live in. You probably have less of all of those. And therefore you have to talk about those services and those service standards you can offer, whether you can do everything to a gold standard. Some of the things we do at the moment, we absolutely do consistently to a very high standard. Can you keep all of those? But that's a debate as you go through the modelling. And it's important at this stage, as part of the work we do with MOPAC and with colleagues from the Home Office, is explain the consequences of decisions. To say, if you do this, these are some of the potential consequences, these are some of the risks that are around that, and then at the end of the day, it's ultimately a decision for elsewhere.
Okay. Have you been given an indicative timetable for when the funding formula will be announced?
No, I think we knew timescales in terms of prior to the election. For obvious reasons, post the election, we've not heard anything. Myself and the chief executive from MOPAC sat on one of the steering groups, so I've been involved and seen some of the working out with other colleagues from across the country, and that was progressing, but obviously it's not progressed during the election period for quite understandable reasons. I certainly have not been party to what is the new timescale. I don't think colleagues have. Okay.
I think if I could just add, in terms of your questions around the police and crime plan and what the implications might be and what scenarios we've been modelling, it really just comes back to your first question around, do we have the resources we need to keep London safe? Because you know, it is incredibly challenging, and we are incredibly worried and concerned that if we carry on with the level of budget cuts that we are facing, we won't have the level of resources we need to really keep London safe and secure, to tackle rising violence, and to tackle all the hidden harms that we know that are increasingly coming to our to people's attention. In terms of the police and crime plan, what that will mean, it will not mean that we don't want to prioritise these areas. It means that we'll make much slower progress. We'll still wish to prioritise them because they are the most important issues facing Londoners and facing the police and families, but we'll have much more difficulty in prioritising them. And in terms of sort of the funding formula, I hope that you'll join with us to try to ask the new Prime Minister and the new previous Home Secretary to just drop the funding formula, because it can be so damaging to London, to look carefully at the National and International Capital Cities grant, give London what it's due, and to make sure that we have the resources that we need to protect London. It's not that we're saying the Met can't be more efficient and there is transformation that needs to take place, but the bottom line in all of this is that you can do the transformation, you can do the efficiencies, but you are then still left with a massive budget challenge.
If the funding formula doesn't go the way that everyone in London would want it to go, and it has an implication on the new police and crime plan, and certain priorities need shifting around, what public engagement do you anticipate doing if you have to make a change to the police and crime plan?
I think what I'm trying to say is that we wouldn't change the priorities and the strategic priorities within the police and crime plan, but what we're making clear is that if the funding formula continues, or what looks as if it might be disadvantageous to London, which frankly it can be, you know, it's very difficult to envisage any change in that allocation that wouldn't disadvantage London, that actually progress on the police and crime plan will be much, much more difficult, and we won't be able to really get on top of tackling violence and tackling the problems that London faces. We will still have the same strategic priorities. We spent a long time consulting stakeholders, the public and partners, around what London, you know, what is important to London and what are the threats around London safety. So we would still have the same priorities.
We're going to move on and talk about the police funding formula, which I think is probably the elephant in the room, and Assemblymember Desai is going to lead on that for us.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Metropolitan, can I firstly ask you, how does the current formula work? The current funding formula?
The short answer.
Leave that one to
Or you could explain the offside rule, whichever you prefer.
I'm glad you got that one,
I
Linda.
take note, there's only three people in the country that understand that, and I don't think any of them are in the room. No disrespect to anybody in the room. I understand it at times, and then it sort of goes out of my head again. Currently, the funding formula, in a way, much in the same way as the proposed funding formula, is driven by indicators predominantly around sort of population, takes into account things like socio-economic sort of factors, but maybe not to the extent that we would want them to. Area cost adjustment, and it allocates different amounts of that sort of nationally available money. It then does something very strange around some of the assumptions around how much local taxation you can raise through council tax, and a number basically sort of pops out at the end in terms of, so for London it would take the number of people actually registered through sort of census or other sort of data things. It would take our sort of scores against whether it's numbers of families without income coming in, etc., etc. It looks at the latest sort of ONS sort of data around what the differential sort of costs of doing business are, etc. And then it comes up with a figure against that sort of formula. Does that make sense?
I think so. It helps.
But I think, you know, in terms of the work that was happening before the general election around the funding formula, I think what you're asking is really key, because there was the expert working group that we are part of, and we were able to feed in indicators that we think that would properly show what the demand and need is in London, such as deprivation, such as, you know, there's all the different types of indicators you'd wish to feed in. But what we were being told before the general election was that there was going to be no transparency or accountability about how those numbers were going to be fed in. There would be no transparency around that, just numbers would come out at the other end. There'd be no transparency or accountability around what balance was going to be given to which indicators, so that we would be able to really understand whether whatever came out of the review was fair and had been put together in a fair way. We were being told that was not going to happen. Now, I don't think we should be doing the funding formula review at all, but if they are going to do that, it has to be transparent and accountable. They have to give exemplifications, and we have to know what indicators are going in and what balance and what priority they're giving those indicators. We weren't being given, we were basically being told you're not going to get that before the election. We have to get that if they are going to continue with the review.
Could I just intercede there? Mr Mackey, did you say earlier on that the Deputy Mayor and someone else from MOPAC was sitting in on the...
No. So there's a number of groups. There's working on the funding formula. There's a practitioners group.
Yeah.
There's an experts group. There's an academic reference group, and there's a senior stakeholders group. I sit there along with a number of chief constables. The chief executive of MOPAC sits on that group as well. Yeah. So as the Deputy Mayor explained, that's where we're feeding in you need to think of these indicators, and that is quite to say it's a lively debate. You'd expect that if you're sitting there representing one of the large rural parts of the country, you're going to make arguments about a funding formula that doesn't cater for rural sparsity and the delivery of services in rural areas. That's the sort of debate that's taking place.
So is that a one-way valve then? You're feeding things in, nothing's coming back?
No, in fact, no, that would be unfair on Home Office colleagues. There is stuff coming back. It's not always the answer you like, but we are obviously collectively pushing quite hard around it. We also had a debate in that forum about the impact of national, international and capital city funding, and talked about just how big an issue that is for London. And you'll be aware, if you've not seen it, there's tables of the relative gearing for the 43 police forces. Some police forces, this is not so much of an issue for them. Yeah. For obviously, for London, the gearing is significant for us. It's about 4 to 1.
And could I just raise, I think the point that the Deputy Mayor is making is so important around the lack of exemplification.
Yeah.
Where we went through the last funding formula, I'm trying to think of the right word, exercise, we couldn't sort of see, we were seeing these big sort of swings in terms of the funding coming out of London up to the £700 million that's been mentioned, and not being able to get underneath some of that sort of data. It's really quite important we see the exemplification, so we see that, and then we can actually track that down to the data, because as we all know, there was quite a big fundamental error in the last sort of set of work, that it got right to the wire before somebody had to go and buy that data from Acorn to unpick it and go, you used the wrong numbers. It was as fundamental as that. So being engaged in that, being able to sort of check all of that in the nicest possible way, I think is really quite important.
And you are able to do that?
We haven't seen, as the Deputy Mayor has said, we have not seen those exemplifications at this stage. I think if it were to go ahead for next year, and they were keeping to the previous timetable that was announced pre-election, to go out and start consulting before recess in July, I think that it becomes a really, really tight timescale, and I think the possibility of there being sort of issues in that, I think that becomes difficult. The other thing I think is pretty difficult is that the work that should have gone alongside the funding formula on the NIC funding basically didn't get done because of the election being called. So from my sort of technical professional perspective, I see it very, I don't actually see how we could safely go into a change for next year without having all of those pieces of work being done and checked through properly, is where I would sit.
So, just to carry on, Deputy Mayor, if I could first ask you, we've been told by amongst other the Mayor that the Met could lose between £184 million and £700 million. Now, we know where the 184 figure comes from, but where does the 700 million come from?
Those are the figures that did come out of the exemplifications the previous time round in 2015. The 184 to 700 million were the parameters of what was happening last time round in 2015, when it was before it was dropped, basically. That's where those figures have come from.
Ms. Pentland, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so the very first, so to be fair to the Home Office, the 700 figure was a figure that we ran within, both within MPS but more broadly across the policing family, to try and, because we weren't being given some of the data to share, we ran through the data that we knew that they were working against the formulas, and that would have, would have given a swing away from London at the first sort of cut of about 700 million. When they went out into consultation, the swing was about 184 million at that stage. When they corrected the data, having sort of found this sort of big error in it, it swung right down to about a 4 million hit on London. So and I think sort of given those sorts of swings around it, it just does not build confidence. And I think it's been able to sort of, and I think there's a bit of common sense that needs to be applied. Would anybody put something together that would see a £700 million swing out of London? Kind of doesn't feel right.
So, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you again, because I have vague recollections of this, because this all occurred under the previous mayor.
Yes.
and of course the previous Home Secretary. And I remember when it was pulled, the situation was very much as you've just outlined, such a vagary of the swing, they had to unpick the whole thing. Because of course it's not just London, it's nationwide, there were problems. So it would be inaccurate then for anybody to say that there are existing government plans to remove between 184 and 700 million pounds from the Met's budget, because there aren't. It was pulled 2 years ago.
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen anything, so I don't know.
So it would be inaccurate. There are no, because I mean, what you've just described is my recollection of events, that there was a draft formula that was going to go out to consultation, and the numbers were very large and detrimental to the Met. It then got pulled and the formula is being reviewed. So there are no government plans at this point in time, and we want to make sure it stays that way, but there are no government plans to take out £700 million from the Metropolitan Police. That would be a fair comment.
So I can't comment on whether or not those figures backed into any plans. I just don't have sight of that, so I don't think I can comment on that.
Last time round, those figures were very much, they were the parameters, and what the Mayor has said, that last time round, when there was a funding formula review, the parameters of that and the swings as have been set out, swung wildly between 184 million and 700 million pounds. That is absolutely accurate. That is what the Mayor has said.
It is accurate
and
in as far
we are
as...
now facing a funding formula.
If I may, excuse me, Miss Linden, if I may, it is accurate in as much as that was what was in the last draft, which was dropped 2 years ago. It is not accurate to say there is in the current draft, is it?
We have had, the Mayor has been very clear that we are facing a funding formula review, which last time round, London could have lost out on these parameters.
In actual fact, Ms Linden, he has not been clear. Because what he has said is, under current government plans, they are planning a cut of between 184 and 700 million. That is factually untrue, isn't it?
What the Mayor has said is that last time round, when London was facing a funding formula review, that the parameters of the cuts that London could have faced was between 184 and 700 million pounds. Now, the central issue here, the central truth here is London is losing out in its budget. It can lose out more dramatically with the funding formula review. We don't know at the moment what that's going to show because there's no accountability or transparency around that. We do know that through the National International Capital Cities grant, we are losing out to the tune, I think it's about 184 million pounds. Again, another, roughly the same.
We will come and talk about the NIC grant in a moment.
The budget, the central issue here is the budget is making London, a position for London, incredibly challenging. And if we continue in this way, and that there are continuous cuts to the budget, the Metropolitan Police budget, it's going to be incredibly difficult to keep London safe and secure.
To be honest with you, we are as one on that. I think we agree with that. I don't think there would be any dissent in the room that we want to make sure that Metropolitan Police is funded accurately. But I think it would be inaccurate to state things that are 2 years out of date. And I think that needs to be placed on record. It is mischievous in the extreme to suggest otherwise. Let's then remember to decide.
One more question, Chair. Ms. Peters, we haven't heard from you yet. Could I ask you, see, if I paint a scenario of a £200 million cut from the budget, what additional savings programme would you explore to meet a gap of, say, a cut of £200 million?
So I don't think it would be a question of thinking about programmes. Policing, as the Deputy Commissioner said, needs to be seen as a system.
So I can speak.
We're going through work over the next few months to look at the scenarios that we need to consider based on current government assumptions, based on scenarios in case things change. And we'll need to work through that. But it's not that there are specific programmes that you would cut, it's that we have to look at the system as a whole. As Deputy Mayor has said, the priorities wouldn't change, so it would be a question of understanding how far and how fast we can move towards delivering on those priorities.
Assemblymember Berry first, then Assemblymember Devell.
Can I ask about the assumptions about the savings that are in your different scenarios? What's the lowest amount you're assuming and what's the highest amount?
As Linda explained, the government position pre-election was that there was flat cash for policing with rising, there are pressures in that coming to us because of rising tax changes, rising demand and so on, but the stated assumption from the government is a flat cash future. We would like to see National and International Capital Cities grant fully funded. We would like to understand what we would be able to achieve in that scenario. But we also understand that before the election, and so we don't know what the current government would think about this, but before the election, the last information we had was government departments being asked to look at a 3 to 6% sort of austerity measure in terms of the kind of size of the pie, and of course we've talked about the funding formula. So there are all sorts of things that could affect us for the future, but as Linda has said, those are the scenarios that we're looking at.
So in terms of so you've got a flat cash scenario, a fully funded NICC scenario, a 3 to 6% cut scenario, and then a changed formula scenario. What are the assumptions you've got inside the changed formula?
We don't have any assumptions. No.
So you're just working on that at the moment.
The bottom scenario that we have is minus 6%. That could be made up of all kinds of different things. How we came to be in that position would be, could be affected by a number of factors.
So that's the biggest cut you've got in your scenarios at the moment. Okay, thanks.
Senator Member DeVal.
So I think there's one thing we can be clear on, that there'll be no loss of policing in Northern Ireland for the foreseeable future. So can we just go back to the issue about the budget, which I think the Director of Finance of the Met was saying that you're working on a 6% reduction strategy, right, in that sense. If a formula was... Sorry, go on.
That's the worst case scenario.
The worst case scenario. If a formula was, let's say the discussions, I may have missed this, can you just describe the timelines of when these discussions come to an end, government makes a decision, and when would the new formula be introduced? What's the working assumptions within the police service around that thinking, if the government was disposed to do? As my colleague rightly said, this has been on the table for a number of years now, delayed. I think you're being unfair, because that's what we've got on the table from the last time. That's the working assumptions we're working to until something new comes up. So what would be the timelines for that?
I think as colleagues have covered, you'd hope that was quite a simple question to answer. That's actually incredibly difficult to answer. I think I would think with London, it's really hard to answer a question around the funding formula for London without understanding what's happening with National International Capital City. And that's a real risk, that we collectively get drawn into a debate around the funding formula, and we all go, phew, and then someone goes, oh, by the way, there's no Nick anymore, or whatever else the new... So you've got to see the funding in the totality. And this is one of the challenges, and I've covered this a number of times before in this committee. This is one of the challenges for London with so many ring-fence budgets. There are so many moving parts of this to keep abreast of, to understand what it does to the totality, that you really do need the combined effort of the two colleagues either side of me who literally watch this on a daily basis. So I think Linda gave you a scenario when she answered the question earlier about the funding formula. You'd almost certainly, if you were going to implement the funding formula for the 18-19 financial year, you'd have to go out before recess into public consultation. So you'd have to go out very, very quickly for public consultation, and then you have to be looking through the autumn to get that moving and implemented.
And in your discussions and the working groups that you've been working on, there's probably you're still in discussions.
Oh yes, yeah.
So that's very unlikely, given the circumstances we are nationally and where people are, that we're going to have a new formula. It's more going to be concentrating on the NIC. We've got some questions later about that.
Genuine answer, I don't know that. It was literally day one for a new team at the Home Office, or a returned Home Secretary. We've not had those conversations yet. I mean, it's conceivable you could really push that through. I think for all the reasons that we've highlighted, without the exemplifications, without the level of detail, and the fact that actually there's 43 forces and 43 police and crime commissioners who are all going to have a view on that. That's a really tight timescale.
And of course, we've got ourselves into this situation because of what's happening across policing across the country and the cuts that have been imposed around that. How do we try and finesse those issues? So in the factors that pertain towards London or urban areas, in your conversations you've had with the Home Office, do you feel, I mean, obviously you've made the best possible case, do you think they understand what the implications are for somewhere like London if they continued with the same thinking in 2015? Which was to take money from us to give to other colleagues who are hard pushed as well. We've had cuts, they've had cuts. Is that... that's exactly what the formula is about, isn't it?
I think senior officials understand the challenges of London as a global city, London as a... It's really hard to say to someone, as a population edges towards 9 million by 2020, we're going to have a smaller and smaller police service.
And of
so
course,
I think people do, on a pure basis, people understand that those pressures and demands on London as a capital city are real, they are evidenced, and there is evidence to support those.
and of course, when we add less numbers, or the numbers that we're working towards now, we add a smaller population.
And that's the... I mean, if you look at both the UK and England and Wales and do the international comparators, our per head of population has gone quite low compared to most international comparators.
Thank you.
I went to the Police Federation. We had a meeting in the Police and Crime Commissioners, and it's the same time in Birmingham as the Police Federation. I went to hear the Amber Rudd speak. It was during the general election campaign, and I came away with a distinct impression that officials may well get the demand that the police are under, but I did not get the impression that the Home Secretary was really factoring that into her thinking about the funding for the police service, because she just kept repeating, the police service have had, you know, your budget has been protected. Now everybody knows that budget was not properly protected. It was flat cash, took no account of inflation or any of the pressures the police service is under, and doesn't take account properly of demand. And this is demand across the country which is rising, but in particular London has real specific needs around demand, around its growing population, its growing visitor population, which is fantastic. You know, London is open. We want more and more people to come here, to visit here, and to enjoy London. But actually, that gives its pressures to the police. And another factor to that, which is what makes London so vibrant, is that London's young population is growing as well, and that brings its own demands as well. I don't think that is being properly factored into any discussions around the funding formula review. Or actually, we keep focusing on the funding formula review, and I know you're going to come on to the other aspect, but actually it's the whole of the police budget we need to be thinking about, not how do you sort of divide up what is there at the moment. The fundamental question is what is there at the moment enough? I don't think it is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, one of the things that we've mentioned a lot is the national and international capital city grants and the deficit there seems to be in that. We're going to look at that now, and Assemblymember Prince is going to lead on that for us.
Thank you, Chairman. This first question is to Linda. How does the Met calculate its requirements for policing a national and international city?
So this is a very difficult process, as you can imagine, and it is as much an art as a science, which is why it's not part of the funding formula, in effect. If it was easy and straightforward, then I think we wouldn't have some of the debates that we do. So if I just take you back a couple of years, when I first sort of came into this role, very much we had a process where HMIC basically checked invoices. It kind of was that kind of process. Where we've moved to with Home Office in the last couple of years is, and in a way it's not necessarily a bid, it almost is a quasi-audit of what has been spent in the previous year. We go through a process of different areas of business that we provide from the Met. We look at the totality of cost in those areas. We go through debate around the proportions of time that we're spending on what we deem to be national and international activity. We then have that conversation with Home Office. We have gone through a panel process of being scrutinised about that. And this isn't a very sort of easy, straightforward sort of process. It is a room like this, and our commanders and other parts of our frontline operation come in to give that evidence, be scrutinised, and where those sort of figures stand up, which they broadly did going through that process that we provide, included in that sort of figure. There were some areas that they felt just didn't, there were a few areas where they felt were just a big city type cost excluded, and then we had a conversation about overheads as well. So it's a very long, detailed process with lots of operational officers coming in and out, myself and other sort of technical people sort of sitting with Home Office, and MOPAC part of that sort of conversation as well. So it's not an ideal process, but it kind of is the best of how we can do that, we think, in terms of not having something that's formula driven.
Sure. Part of the problem appears to be that the Met don't, sorry, not the Met, I apologise, the Home Office do not accept your support costs. You put in a bid for around about 63 million pounds for support costs in the NIC funding formula that you create, and the Home Office don't appear to accept that. Why do you think that is?
I can tell you exactly why that is. So we did have one individual in terms of the technical team in Home Office that did take a view about the application of overheads into grant. We had a very difficult conversation around that because, in my view, that application of not allowing overheads is completely contrary both to what Home Office do with other grants. So if you look at things like CT grants or any other grants that we get, there is an application of overhead to that in a normal way. I think the particular individual taking the decision, in the end it's a moot point because he didn't give us the funding anyway for all of it, but the particular individual took a view that I felt was not consistent with either Home Office or wider government practice around grants, and I still retain that sort of view. So it's a complete difference in technical view. My challenge to that is, if it's not picked up through that sort of proper allocation and funded through that specific grant, it's not funded through a funding formula grant, it automatically falls back on council tax and therefore London taxpayers in effect, which doesn't seem right either. So I think we agreed to disagree on that point. We made sure that when that went to ministers for a final decision, it was noted that I'm not sure that the panel in total sort of agreed with the Home Office interpretation on that, but so it was noted as an issue of disagreement. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I still retain that sort of position.
Okay, well that's helpful. And you're quite right. In most cases, you put in your core costs, and then you have an overheads or support cost on top of that, don't you? Because
I agree.
you have to manage the operation.
Yeah.
So if we accept the Home Office argument that those support costs are not recognised for whatever reason, that gives us a figure of 281.1. Now, if I've read my briefing note correctly, it's possible I haven't, but if I have, when the Met met with the Home Office, they actually agreed costs of up to 228 million. I believe that's the figure they agreed, and then after further discussion, which appears not to have been minuted, they did agree the costs up to 281.
I need to go back and check. My recollection, having sat in all of those meetings, they agreed up to the 281. They didn't agree with the 60. There were marginal disagreements, so it was broadly the 281 that the panel agreed, but I can pull out the minutes of that.
Because in my briefing note here, I've got the Home Office panel directly agrees the 228, and then the Met claims the panel agreed the other direct costs up to 281, but the minutes do not specifically cover those cost areas.
Okay. I take that away and look at it, but my recollection, and I'm fairly clear, that they agreed pretty much all of that 281.
Right. So we've got a number of figures, haven't we? We've got the 343, or 344, which I think Londoners and this committee probably agree with. We've got a 281 figure which the Met claim, and I'm not making any aspersions about that claim, that they and the Home Office agree with. We certainly have factual agreement that the Home Office accept the 228 figure. So why did we get a grant of 174?
My understanding...
That's your party, then.
so if I were to put myself in the Home Office position, that went in as part of the prioritisation, if you like, for the Home Secretary, and it was one of those sort of judgments.
I daren't ask who the Home Secretary was.
He's now Prime Minister.
So clearly, we have a situation where there's big disagreement on the numbers. So is there some way in which we can make a stronger case for our numbers? And I think this committee would support the Met in making those representations, because, it's very important, especially if we are to get a smaller grant for whatever reason, albeit 4 million or 700 million, that we get a real compensation for what it costs the Met in regards to Nick. What else can we do to make the case?
So I do need to check the briefing you've got. I'm not sure that there was disagreement about the numbers coming out of that process. So Sir Richard Mottram chaired that. While we may have disagreed about the overhead issue, I think there was agreement on everything else.
No, just to make it very clear, I'm not saying that there was disagreement. I'm saying we can't, according to my briefing note, we can't find the minute of the agreement.
Okay.
So there's a minute agreeing 228
yeah.
and pennies. The Met are claiming that, and I'm not saying they're wrong, the 281 was agreed, but apparently we can't find the minute.
Okay, well, I can go back and check that, but I'm fairly sure we've got that.
But we also do have a letter from the Home Secretary that was sent to the Commissioner in December 2015, which, when explaining what the NIC grant was going to be for 16-17, that it would be £174 million. And I understand that she acknowledged in that letter that this was 62% of the amount recommended by the Executive Panel.
Oh,
so
right,
this isn't a question of minutes, it's actually we have the Home Secretary writing to the Commissioner, and I'm sure that letter must be available. So.
I mean, at the end of the day, we want to support you to
and at the end of the day,
get
we're
the
sort
money,
of, and as Linda said, I think we're disputing at the margins really, because whether you go with the Met's figures or the Home Office figures without the overheads and some of the other smaller things, on the Met figures we're underfunded by £170 million, by the Home Office figures we're underfunded by £108 million. Either way, that's a really significant amount of money that London's not getting.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. So, just an aside, could I also ask you, I'll put two questions into one actually, around football matches and state visits. How are they funded, or do we get any money for those?
So football, last year we spent in the region of about £7 million on football. We were able to reclaim, I think, in the region of about 1.3 million. And that's to do with the legislation of we can only charge for those areas that are inside that sort of owned stadium or whatever. We can't charge for those areas, say for around sort of tube stations and that public space outside. So it is obviously an ongoing sort of issue that we constantly make points about.
It's not peculiar to London, is it?
No, absolutely not.
So, I mean, it's in the overall number, it's a comparatively small amount of money, isn't it? We're talking about £5 million really, but that we wouldn't be making the argument for that to be included in NIC funding, would we?
We did. That was one of the things they kicked out. But yeah, which your point, I can see why they kicked that one out.
Okay.
Also, it is worth thinking about the concentration of
sorry,
Premier League clubs
the head
in
of
London.
Sorry, hang on a second. Could you say that again?
So it's worth thinking about the concentration of Premier League clubs in London, and so to the extent that there is an argument, it's about the number of concurrent matches that can be taking place in London that need policing at the same time. So
Yeah.
Got
I mean,
with Manchester.
Well, Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield. I mean, there are a number of, but they're very large.
I mean, the fundamental issue is how... I'm not going to get into football clubs.
We're not getting into it. This is dangerous territory on relative merits of particular football clubs.
But the fundamental issue is how much any police service, any police force is able to recoup the cost of policing a football match. We have lobbied government on this because we don't think at the moment it is fair in relation to the costs that are borne by the police and how much they're able to recoup. And we have lobbied on that. We were going to have a meeting, but the general election was called. We'll take that back up.
I can understand why you would make the argument, of course, because more money for the police in London is what I think all of us would want here. On the other hand, the NIC grant is specifically for London being a capital city, isn't it? Yes, and the contrary argument would be that you would have to police this anyway, so it's not peculiar to you being the capital city, and therefore it should be outside the scope of the grant, I would think. But
I think we would lobby as a police service because our colleagues in Manchester and Liverpool, absolutely, there is an issue, and we've seen it in other sort of public service issues. Where is it appropriate to charge? This seems to be a fairly obvious one for policing nationally that we should think about again. I know there is legislation specifically around this that was quite sort of difficult, but it just seems to be a fairly sensible thing we need to keep pushing. But your point, we need to push at that as a national policing issue rather than a London-specific issue.
I think actually the amount of money that is currently available in Premiership football, I don't think it would be unreasonable for the government to legislate that they do make a contribution, frankly. Probably not one player's weekly wage.
Exactly.
And sorry, the head of state question. I mean, we might be saving a few bob because someone may not be coming.
So you're pressing all my buttons today, so this is this is another issue that we can't sort of get funding for. So we again had the conversation around visits, whether it's sort of Trump or other sort of state visits or state occasions. It was deemed to be not sort of regular enough to be able to be funded through NIC. So we had estimated we spend on average of about £4 million a year, and that's if nothing sort of special is happening on these sort of one-off type events. I think the panel, when we had the NIC debate, were sympathetic to that issue, but felt it was something that they couldn't fund through NIC as a standing item. The issue for us within London, given these sort of one-off events, Home Office have what they call a special grant pot of money that police forces can apply for. But the issue for us as London is the bar to be able to access that money. One event needs to cost more than 1% of your net revenue expenditure. So it means that one event would have to cost significantly more than £20 million for us to even get through the front door and have that conversation, which is really problematic. So if you look at an event like the Chinese visit that we had sort of last year, in terms of what we can claim for, which is the additionality of overtime and those sort of costs, just over 2 million. So £2-3 million is probably the cost of that type of event in terms of the additional costs. So again, it's one of those things that we haven't got a funding route to. It doesn't come through funding formula, doesn't come through NIC, we can't access special grant. So again, it kind of falls on our core funding. We have had some, and again we're just opening up the dialogue again, given sort of recent events, having the dialogue again with Home Office to say, given that there was that level of sympathy through the sort of NIC conversation, to look at it again, we really do need to open up this conversation, because the 1% really just stops the Met Police being able to be treated in the same way as another force.
Yes, I suppose with most other forces, they would easily get to that 1%.
Exactly, exactly the
We'll
point.
just have to send them all to Manchester or something.
That would be good.
And it's the consistent number of those. If this was just a one-off each year, it's then an international conference moved in, it's then something else, and before you know it, you're spending sort of £2 to £10 million a year just on these sort of events.
Right, and has that 1% that applies to each individual event, not the aggregate cost?
You can't, no. We've tried that one as well.
I'm sure you did. Yeah, all right, I think that does it for me, actually.
Okay, so Member Berry.
Just a quick question on this. Your submission document that we've got in our papers here says that you also help out other forces when they have special events. The example given is the NATO conference in Wales in September 2014. Do we get reimbursed by those forces for that, or does that come out of our budget?
No, we do get reimbursed, and equally so with recent events, we reimburse other forces that come and help. But I think going back to some of the earlier conversation, that ability to support each other as forces, I think it's one of those issues when you start talking about sort of funding formula. I think it's the Deputy Mayor's point, unless you look at that overall sort of national sort of funding for policing, we can all be scrabbling over this sort of shrinking piece, and looking at that national resilience picture is quite difficult. So we try and look at it both ways.
And are you aware whether or not Wales was able to claim on the special grants for that particular operation?
They did.
Because it became over 1% of its budget.
Absolutely, they
Okay, thank you.
did, yeah.
Okay, a couple of tidying up questions before we move on. The Home Office Executive Panel, who sits on that? Or who sat on that?
Sorry, this is for the NIC.
We refer to the Home Office agreeing figures or disagreeing figures, and it's the Home Office panel we're talking about, isn't it? Who sat on that?
I'll need to come back to you. It's chaired by Sir Richard Mottram, and it had the then senior people from the Home Office on that. So Ziggy MacDonald.
The HMI was on it.
London
HMI was on it, so there's a professional reference. It was then Steve Otter.
Steve Otter was on it. I'll get you a full list.
If you could, that would be useful. So it's Home Office officials primarily, but with some additional support. Okay, that's good. The other thing, is the last NIC grant submission to the Home Office was in 15-16, wasn't it? And that's where the 374 million comes up. Nothing submitted since then?
No, so...
Because that one included things like the phone hacking scandal, or the phone hacking investigation. And the obvious question, I suppose, is would a more recent bid be more likely to get agreement?
So what we've agreed to do, in that I think Home Office obviously put us through a very significant exercise, and we came out with very little at the end. What they've agreed, which got sort of halted by sort of PERDA, was really just to look retrospectively at last year, because there are areas where we have spent less on, so the example you've given, but equally areas where we've spent more on. So rather than looking at the whole sort of 100% again, to focus in, and we agreed a couple of areas that we both knew there were ups and downs. That would have been part of the work that we would have been doing over the last couple of months, hadn't we not sort of got into... So
is it something that would ordinarily be negotiated and awarded annually, or is it a multi-year settlement?
It's not multi-year, so if
trying to get it to that, haven't we?
Yes, although obviously we wouldn't want to lock in at a low rate, but absolutely, the discussions that we were having, if we could get it to a proper footing and lock it alongside that sort of funding formula, lock it into that sort of 4 years, absolutely there needs to be sort of checks and balances on that to make sure that we are spending appropriately. I wouldn't sort of object to that at all. But as Craig says, trying to get that into a 4-year bit, because I have to say it was a huge amount of work to take this through to the level that they wanted to scrutinise that huge amount, and not just for me and my team. I think I was really sort of quite concerned about the amount of time it took of frontline officers.
Okay, so it's been locked at 174 million for 3 financial years.
It's not been locked at the moment, so at the moment it is what it is, and every year it's re-agreed, subject to the this sort of what has changed. That's
has the level changed since 15-16?
No, but what we will do in terms of the funding for the current year and sort of next year is just to make sure that we are, if there are things that are fundamentally changing, basically we're all agreed about 80% of what's in there carries on. Let's check those things that may have gone up, those things that may have gone down. I wouldn't expect there to be a huge change in the number unless if we go back to that sort of discussion around the overall funding debate, unless something fundamental shifts there, we're not seeing much change in terms of that application.
Okay. Right, we'll have a look at council tax and other income and funding sources to the Met, and Assembly Member Berry's leading on that.
Before you do, I just wondered if you were going to come on to the Police Transformation Fund, because that's one other element when we think about the funding for the police service and what's happening with the budget for the Metropolitan Police.
I don't think we are talking about that, are we?
Because maybe it's something you can come back to, because there's obviously the funding formula and there's the NIC. But one of the other concerns that we have is a top slice from the main budget, which is going into the National Police Transformation Fund. Now, completely on board with transformation, efficiency and improvements in the service, but that's going to rise to a figure of about £700 million by year 3. London, we have to bid into that, and we don't get our fair share back from that. And it's an annual round. It's very difficult to do really long-term sustainable planning, where some of our funding is for the Metropolitan Police is dependent on bidding and allocations on a yearly basis. I just think if you're looking at the budget for, in the round, you do need to also have in your sights the Police Transformation Fund and what that means for London.
Okay, I think we will have to scope that to look at that further. But before we move off that, 700 million, the figure that you just quoted, that's a nationwide figure?
It's rising to £700 million in year 3, nationwide, yeah.
Okay, and the Met has to bid in for that annually?
Yep. Yes.
Okay, and how much does the Met get at the moment?
I don't have those figures in front of me. Having raised this issue, I haven't got the figures.
So we don't know for this year because we've put a number
How
of
much did
bids
we get
into
last
the
year?
process.
It was very small
last year. It was a very tiny fund. It was the Police Innovation Fund. It was different title.
20 or 30 million last year.
20-30 million, it's that sort of range.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, having raised that, I think that's quite useful. We'll investigate further and we'll bring that back next time. Okay, Assembly Member Barry.
So I wanted to ask about GLA funding and council tax. It seems like the GLA is only putting in about 20% of the Met's budget, and the rest of it is coming from central grants, as we've been discussing. So can I ask sort of all of you really, do you think the Met is too dependent on centralised funding? Would you want to be raising more yourself?
There is a question with the devolved arrangements around business rates. It's an area that could be examined. I don't think we have taken a view of preference. Obviously, it's the totality of funding we're more concerned about, but I think there is, as we look sort of ahead, and there's more devolution of business rates, that may be a discussion that the GLA want to have across London.
I mean, that you quoted about 20%. It's our figures are 24% to 76%. So about 76% of our money is main grant, and the gearing works very roughly. So a 1% change in the precept will give us about 5.7 million. Lose 1% on grant, you lose 19 million. So that's how the gearing works. And I said at the start, there's actually some quite useful charts. We'll make sure you've got them of where every single force is in the country on that gearing split. So there's some that are almost 50-50. So they're less prone to big movements in central grant. The challenge for anyone, and I'm certainly not making a political point here, the challenge for anyone is when your gearing's at that point, it's very hard to get away from that position. Short of saying, I don't know, you're going to put precept up 20% a year for the next 5 years, or whatever the figure would be, it's really hard to move those figures when you've got gearing that hard against you.
Yeah. No. Do you have any comment, Deputy Mayor?
Sort of following on from what Craig said, the fundamental issue around the budget, fundamental issue around the budget for the Metropolitan Police is that we aren't getting our fair share. There isn't enough in the budget for policing, I think, nationally, because we're discussing how you divide up a smaller pie. The issue around should London have more ability to keep some of its resources and to raise some funds, there is just going to be the fundamental issue of how, what that would mean about percentage increases in council tax and what it is fair to expect people of London to be shouldering on their, shouldering. It comes back to National International Cities Grant as well, in terms of how much should people of London be shouldering some of the responsibilities for living in a capital city. And you've got to be very careful, because actually, in terms of percentage increases, to really change that balance, you're going to be looking at some substantial increases. I mean, the Mayor did put up the precept last year, by 1.99% in order to try to protect frontline policing and the police officer numbers. We are taking our share of responsibility on that.
Has the Mayor been seeking any sort of further devolved powers to raise money in different ways? Obviously, council tax is a difficult one, but are there any other ways in which he's been seeking to raise funds?
I mean, you can look at the retention of business rates, and that has been looked at in other parts of City Hall.
Okay, on the council tax, the Mayor did only put up the council tax by 3/4 of what he could have done. The overall GLA precept went up 1.49%, not 1.99%. It was possible for the mayor to add an extra. It was only 4.3 million, which is a tiny amount in terms of the numbers we're talking about. But that could have been added to the precept for the GLA as a whole and then transferred into the Met budget. It's what actually we proposed in our Green Group amendment, and the GL officers were quite happy to do that. Did you consider doing that?
I'm not sure what
in the budget this year.
I'm not sure what figure you're referring to, because in terms of the precept rise that the Mayor put into the budget last year and putting some of the buoyancy around council tax, it was an additional £27.8 million that went into the policing, it went into the Metropolitan Police. I'm not sure what 4.4 is that you're talking about.
The Mayor put in an extra 11.2 million into the police directly through his council tax increase.
If I could help.
And that was 1.49%. So that was 3/4 of what the increase could have been.
that was the net amount, because the Home Office grant went down by 17 million. So the figure that the Deputy Mayor has just quoted of 28 million is correct. But the net increase was 11 because 17 went on the Home Office grant. So I think what you're alluding to is that the precept increase could have been larger.
Yes.
But it would have been a larger figure than you just quoted. It would have been more than the 4 million. Because the net increase of a 1.99% increase across the whole GLA family is bigger than that.
Should we stick to percentages then? Because it was increased by 1.49% and it could have been increased by 1.99%. Was that considered? Because it could have been moved between the different bits of the GLA. And I think then it would have been in your base for next year.
Well, in terms of the precept increase last year, the money that went in and the Mayor took the decision, it is a really difficult decision to raise council tax, because you've got to make the balance between what it's right for the council taxpayers of London to shoulder responsibility, what they can afford as well. These are really difficult, challenging times for individuals, and putting extra council tax on them, and what London needs. And I think the Mayor in the budget for this year has taken the right decision around the balance between what is needed and the increase that was put in.
The Mayor did describe it as the most he could do, and that he was only going to do that in order to create more.
He raised council the precept by 1.99%, and that was what is expected
on the Met proportion, on the Met portion.
And that is what central government actually expects in terms of precept increases, and then takes into consideration in terms of the grant that's coming back of the 1.99%, and that's what we did.
Sorry to ask, are you following the point that I'm making though, that the overall GLA precept could have been increased by 1.99%, not 1.49%? This was in the budget amendment that we put forwards and the budget submission that we made to the Mayor. I'm asking if you've considered that.
And my answer to that was, in terms of what the decisions around precept and council tax increases are taken in the round around what's considered appropriate in the burden that's put on Londoners in terms of council tax, and that's in the considerations of that, you do look across the piece. It was considered that this was the appropriate amount, and also put the right, met the responsibilities that central government have been putting down in terms of putting money back into the policing budget in order to protect frontline policing.
So you are saying that you considered putting more into the police budget, but you decided not to?
No, what I've said is that you make it, the decision is a balance between what's appropriate in terms of council tax, the burden on Londoners, and trying to ensure that you're fulfilling the responsibility in protecting frontline officers, and that's the decision that was taken.
Okay. I'm asking you because it was a political decision. We're talking about £1.50 a year to the average household, and I'm pretty certain the public would have been behind you on that, and they were behind the increase that the Mayor did put forward. Moving on, I should move on now. What alternative funding sources is the Met working on in the future? This might be something more for Matt.
So in terms of other income outside grant, council tax, we raise about 260 million a year. A huge chunk of that comes from Transport for London in terms of those services we provide, also Heathrow, Palace or Westminster, etc. So we have got a core amount of additional income that we obviously need to protect and make sure that we claim that. The other areas that we're looking at, I suppose there's different sort of buckets of things that we're working on at the moment. At one level, I think one of the things that I'm quite impressed with in terms of coming into the Met is there's an awful lot of innovation going on. I know we don't always sort of feel that, but some of the products that we as police forces use and then provide pretty much for nothing to industry is quite astounding. So we need to be much sort of smarter in terms of how we capture some of that IP and make sure that that works for us. While it's great that it drives down crime, we also need to make sure that we are just a bit smarter about the way we do that. In terms of some of the other sort of commercial agreements that we can have with different areas of business, again, looking at those, and we've got things that we're working through. And third area, working very sort of closely with the help of TfL around some of their sort of merchandising. They're much better than we are in terms of getting their products out. So we're quite sort of pleased with how that's sort of going as well. So while that's not going to fill our budget gap, we do think that's a really important thing to do just in terms of getting our brand out, particularly getting that into some children's toys areas. We think it's a really good thing to do anyway. So we have got that sort of strategy coming back to management board over summer to be agreed and then come through to the deputy mayor to be agreed. But we're working really actively on that and we're quite excited about some of those opportunities.
And do you have any idea of the income you can expect from that yet?
Certainly in the first couple of years, I think we're talking hundreds of thousands rather than millions, but we will get to maybe sort of a couple of £1 million. So I think it's, while it's something we absolutely need to be doing, we are really sort of energised about it. It's that sort of scale. It's not going to be even in the tens of millions that we'll be able to met in terms of net profit, if you like.
Okay, but even though it's only a small amount, it's still worth doing.
We think it's, even if some of these things, even if there was no money, we think it's a good thing to do anyway in terms of our brand and making sure that we're just getting that our name out there and getting products there.
And this will all be in the business plan that comes with
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Assemblymember Deval.
Can we go back in terms of Heathrow Airport and I presume City Airport?
Yeah.
Are they, is that a full cost recovery from those institutions or what's it based on? Because Heathrow is fairly contained, isn't it, in a sense that you wouldn't be there unless the airport was there, and of course some of the things you're dealing with are more complex and even more critical. So how does it work?
So there are obviously some things that we want to do anyway. We would want to have a presence in the airports. We've just gone through a fairly difficult process over the last year to get that in terms of what we think are their responsibility, getting to full cost recovery. Part of that was previously funded through some of our counter-terrorism monies. So what we've been asked to do in terms of the national position around counter-terrorism, there was a difference in treatment between airports around the country. We have gone through the negotiations with Heathrow and City. City, I think, are at full cost recovery this year. Heathrow will just take slightly longer to get to full cost recovery, but we're on that sort of very short trajectory to get them to that position.
And City Airport?
I think we're already at full cost recovery.
Okay. I mean, I don't want to go into details, but in terms of some of the ancillary patrols and other issues outside those areas, is that the same argument of football grounds? You're responsible for inside the stadium.
Yes.
That's how we get the full, and outside is our responsibility, which could be added to the counter-terrorism grant.
So the counter-terrorism grant won't sort of pick up some of those issues,
Just
but so
okay.
one of the things that we're discussing is if there is possibility of more disquiet in public areas, how we come to an arrangement around some of those things. So there's a bit of a live debate around that at the moment.
And of course, some of this is peripheral and small beers in numbers, but very important in terms of policing. So the outstanding issue on the football issue is we're quite clear, inside the stadium we charge, outside the stadium we don't. Is that fair? I know it's a bit blunt at that.
Called the footprint.
And we need government to either change the rules to do it. Can we just then talk about entertainment venues then? Large scale AEG O2 issues and the policing presence there. Is that a full cost recovery? Is there an arrangement and deal done?
It's exactly the same rules. If it's inside, you can look at full cost recovery, and it's done in a number of places. But if it's outside the event, no.
Right. Okay, so there isn't an arrangement. So, is there a list of some of these, not arrangements that you have with these? I mean, we can talk about borough policing.
Yeah.
So there's the TFL deal that comes to mind, isn't it, on transport?
TFL deal,
teams,
some of the large
boroughs.
shopping centre deals.
Yeah.
We can certainly give you the details.
Just a list of what they are,
Yeah.
and where they are, and when they're coming up for renewal, and when they are.
So
It
we've
would
got
be
some
quite
of them that
interesting
are
to see.
contracts and some that are one-off events.
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Well, okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Okay, we're going to have a look at savings programmes now. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, to Linda, trying to look through your savings, you seem to have removed all digital policing savings from your future plans. Can you explain why?
So I think if we go sort of slightly back in history, I think most of you are aware of the history with digital policing. We had an interim chief information officer and pretty much an interim management team being supported by a consultancy in terms of plans. Where we got to in terms, and I think sort of Angus McCallum has come to the committee before to talk through his digital strategy. Having developed his digital strategy, costing that up, where we got to in January earlier this year, in essence, it became clear that the previous plans didn't stack up financially, so I was not comfortable at that stage to be including savings that I neither saw a plan to deliver nor had any confidence that we would deliver. So at that stage, the conversations that we had, both as a management board with MOPAC and with GLA, were that it was not appropriate to go forward with those savings in the budget. It just wasn't supportable.
Okay, so that was the stuff we looked at in January in detail. We had a cumulative 38 million of savings going up to 2020, 2021. You're saying they just were not achievable, so you've taken it out?
Yes.
Yes. So part of the work that we're doing over the summer, and I'm sure we'll come on to the future budget process, is what is achievable in that space. So I think probably when Angus was here, we talked about the inability at the moment to rationalise applications as you go through some replacement of big core systems. So some of the cost base in that is just the pure number of applications in there. We probably touched on in the detail in some of the things in the target operating model. In the past, we were funding programmes and projects through capital money. So when you save the capital money, it was having no impact on the revenue budget. So there were some things that just had to be unpicked, and that's part of the summer work. We've also got a thing with some of the national applications. So some of the national applications, we have no control over costs. They're just a straight pass-through. So some of the national applications that all forces have to buy in, they're just, so if it goes up 4%, let's say this year, we have no control over that whatsoever.
And do you have some sort of detail of what the sort of IT projects are that you are actively pursuing, and therefore what savings you're expecting? Because it seems to me over the years, and I haven't been on this particular committee, but across the public sector, IT projects always seem to go wrong. They never make the savings. But have you got a proper plan that, given that you've reviewed this since January in the last few months, that you think is genuinely achievable?
We can show you the entire portfolio of programmes, of which there are 12, and you'll see all the digitally enabled ones in there. So things like the one that's going on at the moment, the rollout of mobility, which replaces things like XP and those sorts of things. You can see all of that in there, and you can actually come and see it happening.
I think that would be helpful if we could have that information, please. Given you've taken this out only since January when we had your budget, what does this mean for getting a balanced budget over the year?
So in terms of the finally agreed budget that was formally agreed, we had taken it out as part of the finally agreed budget, so we did have a balanced budget.
Sorry, could you speak up? You taken it out after the budget was agreed?
No,
or
before.
Before.
Okay.
So we absolutely had a balanced budget at time of agreement.
Okay. And how are the other Met savings and reform programmes progressing? And do they set you to be in a position where you're going to achieve further savings if needed?
So in terms of last year, we had a target last financial year to make savings of 127 million. We did have the issue that we discussed around digital policing, so we had that. The only other saving that we didn't hit was on our overtime reductions, but we did make a very sort of clear decision as a management board that we decided that that was no longer appropriate in year to deliver. In terms of the rest of the savings, I think we had about £11 million that were late and about 72 million absolutely sort of delivered as stated. So I think the two sort of major issues for us that we talked a lot about at management board were the issue around digital policing and the decisions around overtime.
And in fact, on overtime, you'll see in the finalised budget we put money back in.
Okay.
We think professionally we'd gone too far.
Yes, you've reviewed that and adjusted. Yeah. Okay. And then in the 2016-17 year, you missed your planned savings by £45.5 million.
So it's mostly DP, so I'm not
Digital.
sure I recognise the figure of 45, but
okay, it's you delivered 81.4 million of a planned 126.9 million in savings.
yes, so in
which is
terms
the
of
gap.
the delay of the 11 that delayed into the current year, so that would be right. Okay.
No, I'm not following that, sorry. 45.5 million, you were below your target for savings. How have you therefore met that? Is that the digital taken out plus?
So we had an amount for digital, so I'm just trying to think where my figures are. So we had digital, I think was about 27. We had, in terms of overtime, sorry, I will just get to the right place. So we had 27 digital policing, broadly about 13 on overtime, and obviously with overtime we had issues such as the Westminster attack and things like that, and the Allard court case. So we didn't make savings of about 40. In terms of, we then had a number of savings that didn't quite sort of land in year that total 14 million.
But what does this really mean for future years? And I understand you've revised your opinion on digital savings, on overtime, but what confidence can we have going forward that when you put up, we're going to make these savings, you're going to be able to deliver them, and also, you know, for the mayor as well?
Okay. So I don't want to sound defensive, but I think a lot of those savings we had made, we had two specific problems around the digital policing area, and we had the problem around sort of overtime. So I would draw that, while they are big and significant, I'm not sure that that is reflective of everything else that we do. In terms of the 75 million that we've got in for the current year, I think we have got high levels of confidence on that. There are a couple of those that we will be keeping a very sort of close eye on to make sure they keep on track, and we report this through in detail on a quarterly basis, and if anything sort of fundamentally changes, we report that through on a monthly basis.
It's one of the ways you're going to manage to balance your budget by slowing or even stopping recruitment, because your unaudited statement of accounts, I think, was published this morning, and in that it shows that you underspent 41.5 million on police officer pay in terms of recruitment, and 31.3 million on police staff. And of course within that it has designated detention officers, forensic healthcare nurses and other officers in the boroughs. So is that how in some ways you're going to manage the budget, by just delaying recruitment?
It certainly wouldn't be our first choice by any means. So in terms of specifically the staffing underspend, we didn't put our foot on the brake with that at all. For example, the two sort of major drivers around sort of staffing are around the recruitment in custody suites. So we have had major recruitment sort of processes to get people in place. We didn't manage to get that sort of fully people into those sort of jobs. In turn, that's driven up some of the overtime that we've just been discussing.
Which I realise you counter in here.
Equally, we've got the issue around making sure that we've got proper healthcare provision. The healthcare issue, because about a year ago there was a decision that we thought was landing in terms of that function being transferred to the health service. We were very clearly not recruiting into that space because it was moving into a different model. That decision was reversed, so therefore we were behind the curve in terms of having those sort of posts sort of fully funded. So I just want to assure you, we don't go into the year planning not to do these things. We go into the year with balanced budgets, with the expectation to do with what it says on the tin.
Okay, they're significant. I realise they're counted partly by overtime, but those are significant differences.
Just on this point, Assemblyman de Val, I think, was to come in off the back of this, if you're finished with that.
I think the Met's come a long way, and we were very fortunate to have a technical briefing about some of the reports that you receive. And it goes to the heart of the matter about that, of course, you need to achieve your savings, but sometimes you need to spend your budget on crucial areas, and on policing, I think it's pretty critical. What I thought came over from that briefing, and I think is coming over from some of these issues, is about when and where can, managers intervene that something is going awry. Should it be left to the top of the organisation to spot some of those problems? Or are there other checks and balances that need to be introduced, and where, who's checking the checkers, but also about where's the rest of the organisation taking some responsibility too? I think there are the blunt instruments, and overtime is a policing tool as much as stop and search. I think that's a lesson I've learned over the years and understand that. But equally, some of the issues of management by drift, which, maybe I'm being unfair, I don't think I am, I can have a debate about it, the custody suites, recruitment of staff in some of those issues. So where, in terms of change Met and the new world that I think has, in terms of some of the fiscal, financial monitoring, some of the issues that I think my colleagues have been alluding to before, what work is being done with the managers at appropriate levels to say, hold on, it's not all up here that we spot that something's not quite right. Where's the rest of the organisation? Where's the ownership from the other parts of the Met?
Well, custody is a really good example because despite the belief that probably AC Territorial Policing, so Martin Hewitt sits there pulling those levers, he doesn't. The reality is that sits within the custody command itself. So the custody command itself will decide when it wants to go out and recruit. So that DDO programme requires absolutely getting in the timelines, all the practical stuff about getting there. They make those decisions in terms of doing it. Their budgets are monitored on a monthly basis in terms of where they are. They'll look at it in relation to the flex across the workforce. The custody one as well was also affected this year by decisions around whether some custody units stay open, because we've got an over-provision of custody units. Now, that's not a popular message operationally, but quite frankly, if you look at some of the scenarios going forward, you can't afford the custody provision we've currently got.
Craig, so another argument here.
Oh, no, I know. And you and I have had this one.
It sounds like hospital beds to me and some of the issues in the NHS. We went through some of those issues. In 2 years' time, when we come back in here, we can't lock somebody up because we haven't got a custody suite in operation or they're too full. That will be the testament of that discussion.
No, but I go back to... So what would you do then? Would you trade your neighbourhood officer for your custody suite?
Well, I don't know, but I wouldn't leave Bexley Police Station with modern custody facilities that have been upgraded and meet all the Human Rights Acts, and they're left vacant and not in use. It don't make sense. A police investment that was done in the past, are you telling me that was crap and the wrong decisions that we were taking? Or was it the right decision and they should be used effectively and efficiently?
I'm sure we will come back to custody because we spoke about this in some detail a few months ago here. You've seen what's happening with custody numbers. From a number of national policy initiatives that have changed about people coming into custody units. Now, you can keep, some of you probably saw was it the FOI 3 or 4 weekends ago, staying in a custody suite in London and elsewhere is more expensive than the Hilton and those sorts of things. You can keep those sort of facilities there, mothball them, we'll keep all those officers in there, but somebody has to take some money from somewhere in this system. And those are the difficult debates. If we all say everything's a priority, we go out of here and someone else has to make those calls.
Someone's got to take the decision, but for us to have the confidence that we're taking the decision not based on fads and fashions, that actually it's going to be there and it's fit for purpose and it'll survive at least 5 years of a business plan, and we'll stick with it. The trouble is, there's too many of the Met issues where we've made changes and we're now doing U-turns on or not, or going back, albeit with better evidence of understanding and maybe avoiding some of the problems. I take that, but sometimes organisations don't get it right. Yeah. And the Met, is part of that.
I think we're absolutely one. If you could give me a stable picture for 3 or 4 years, I'd shake your hand. Or, nobody would run a £3.2 billion, the most important public service in London, and we're running it on an annual basis. In the last 5 or 6 years, I've planned virtually every year for an organisation that's either tiny or enormous, and anywhere on the continuum in between, with all the work, all the energy that takes. If nothing else, the plea we've been putting into governments of all persuasions, let's go back to multi-year settlements. So in the last 5 years, we've signed multiple contracts where you don't know all of the issues that you're going to face 18 months out, let alone 18 years out. That's a really difficult place to plan and work in. So I'm absolutely with you, but the sad reality at the moment, most policy initiatives that happen nationally often have a time horizon of 12 months at most.
I just want to remind the committee, in 2000 when we arrived here, the then current Met Commissioner was talking about we needed prison ships because we never had enough. I don't think we're anywhere near that.
If I want to bid for ships, yes, I'll come back.
But I'm not anywhere near that. It's really about the decision making and then about the final decision, but also about ownership, about when to intervene and when not. Because I'm all for making the savings, but equally, I'm more to making sure that where it's appropriate, those budgets are spent effectively with the right decisions.
And we absolutely support you, and I think it's something we've been trying to land internally, because a lot of people, and it goes back to some of the question, talk about these things, that these are not budget problems. You can balance the BEPS budget really easily if you have to, but they're very quickly operational service delivery problems and challenges. The Met has got enough swing room in a budget this size to be able to do all the things you say if it really needed to. Not suggesting you'd run a budget like that. They're not budget problems. You can balance this budget, might be unpalatable, but they're very quickly operational and service delivery problems. And that's the thing we focus on.
Before I come back to Assemblymember Pigeon, it's one thing that came out of that exchange with both Assembly members. How do you plan your recruitment? Because this is a real political touchstone. And we've had a budget until the current budget for 32,000 police officers for 8 consecutive years. We haven't hit 32,000 police officers for 5 years. Why not?
Sorry, we haven't hit?
Yes, why not?
We got to 31,957, which I think
in 2012,
which was the figure. No, since then we're there in about 2015. Yeah. The audited or the unaudited accounts that Assemblymember Pigeon has just referred to various vacancies throughout the force, and the implication was that you are relying on deliberately not filling those posts in order to make up budget savings. And we've just heard that you're putting overtime budgets back up again, and personally I have no problem with that, because I think that we have to police London adequately.
But one way to do that, of course, is to put officers on the street. And if you are running, I think the figure is now close to 2,000, below the 32,000, leaving aside the budget settlement, we don't want to get to that row again, of what happened in February. But why have the Met chosen not, in terms of the recruitment round and the timing of it, to fully staff according to the budget that you have available?
So I'll just go back. You said, so 2015, 31,944, 2016, 31,720. So we were always at, I think 32,000 was the rounding figure used, but the figure we always quoted was the 31.
It was, but then the rationale that we had for this year's budget settlement was, well, we're going to take £32 million out of the police staffing budget because we know we're not going to hit 32,000. We haven't been there for some time, so we can take that money without any loss to frontline policing. How does that logic stack up with what you've just said?
What, with quoting the establishment from 2015?
Well, you've just listed a number of years where it was at or around 32,000.
Yeah.
The argument that we heard during the budget debate for this financial year was that we know we're not going to hit 32,000. We haven't hit it for some period of time. Therefore, we can take that £38 million without reducing frontline policing. That seems contradictory to what you've just said.
Well, all I've done is quote you when we were at 32,000. And if we need to, I can quote all the way back to 2007, but for the sake of brevity, I won't in terms of doing it. So when we did the budget profile this year, we talked about what was achievable and what was realistic in terms of doing it. The reality, as we approach this planning for this next budget, one of the things we'll talk about is what is an achievable size of the organisation. The reality with recruitment, it's really a cost and a metric now. You can turn it up or down depending on what you need in terms of doing it. We're looking at shaping an organisation for this next year that looks somewhere just over 30,000.
And that's based on what?
Based on the budget assumptions we're working on at the moment. Now that will probably change during the summer, might go up, might go down, but that's how we work each year.
I think one of the things that's really difficult in coming into policing, having worked in other bits of the public sector, in terms of getting that sort of recruitment right, it is like putting a very sort of soft brake on, because it takes, I think, is it 9 months start to finish in terms of that recruitment process. So if a colleague was here from that sort of HR bit, they need to be thinking not just about this year, they need to be thinking about next year and how we get that sort of flow right, because what you don't want in recruitment is great big leaps and then fallow periods. So I think it gets back to Craig's earlier point. What almost more important than the amount of money is having that stability to plan, so that we can just get this right and make sure that it's as smooth as possible. I think is really important for us.
So your planning assumption now is 30,000 police officers in London?
Up of 30,000. So 30,000.
Upwards of 30,000.
So 30,000 upwards. So 30,200, 30,500. We will work through the detail over the coming weeks and months.
Okay, because the fear that Londoners have is that we've had a budget for 32,000. We haven't hit that figure for some time. If the working assumption now is, let's say, 30,500, you're going to come in under that, aren't you?
I generally don't know until we see the numbers. There are so many figures that if you could give me certainty that the pay award issue at 1% is going to be that for the next 3 years, because that's built into the assumptions. If that changes, a 1% move in pay will drive £25 million of extra cost into the budget. There are so many variables in this. This is why it really does take the level of detail it does to plan this and work it through. As Linda said, we're working with a machine that's probably got an 18 to 24 month timeline and trying to fit it into a 12-month window.
Second Member Pigeon, back to you, and then we'll come back to some of the
The Mayor has set you a target of 85% of all spend to be on the frontline policing. In terms of HMIC report, 73% of the Met's workforce are police officers. If you're going down to around 30,000 or just above, how are you going to meet that target set by the Mayor?
I think there's two different indicators we're talking about there. So the 85% is based on, I think the way it's interpreted is us achieving 15% back office costs. So our true back office being only 15% of our gross revenue expenditure,
Okay.
and the other 85% of expenditure being on things other than back office. The HMIC definitions and the definitions the GLA use, you remember we've had this before with the sort of activity cost codes as well, use slightly different definitions.
Okay.
So there's also a middle office in the HMIC's one as well. One of the challenges we had last year with some of that data, public protection moved from being a frontline cost to a back. All of a sudden you think, what's happened to the data? So in fairness, it's two different sets of
The
data.
way to look at it is 15% of your costs being back office,
Yes.
and therefore everything else
Yeah.
would be described as frontline policing. It doesn't mean police officers. Okay. That's very
I've never taken it as a direct
Yeah.
proxy for police officers.
But I'm just interested, first time I've heard you talking about 30,000 or just above as effectively what you're working to, because the Mayor's strategic target remains at 32,000.
That's to do with scenario planning.
Yeah, exactly.
We haven't done the numbers of what it would be if it was 6%. If you said we got all of Nick plus a bit more, it could be different. The reality is at this point in the cycle, you've got to start to use some planning assumptions. Otherwise, it would be even worse than the scenario described to say to the organisation, I tell you what, we're not going to talk about this, we're not going to plan anything, we're not going to have any conversations until we get a budget in November.
And could you just clarify before I bring Deputy Mayor in that I can't remember the natural wastage, it's a horrible term. Is it 1,600?
It's somewhere between 1,600 and 1,800 turnover. Our
That's
turnover is
every year.
about 5% of the organisation. It's actually quite low.
Okay, so 1,600, 1,800 per year.
Yes.
And just on PCSOs, are you doing any number crunching around that and looking at reducing PCSOs?
I haven't seen a model for that yet. I think the PCSOs came down quite a lot during if you remember, during sort of what I would call phase one. So we got to the position where it was the one dedicated PCSO per ward, plus the PCSOs in the Safer Transport Command and a few others. I've not seen a model that brings those down any further.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Mayor, do you want to comment on
Yeah,
that?
just pick up on a couple of issues that sort of arisen from that exchange from the questions. The first is, are we recruiting are we doing a recruitment, recruiting in order to achieve underspends to go to savings? No, we're not. Absolutely not. And in fact, I've had discussions with the Met around where there have been undershooting on, where there is underspends on recruitment going forward, that it doesn't go towards savings, but it is put aside for police officer pay when we do the recruitment. You'll know that recruitment, there are difficulties with recruitment. It isn't an exact science anyway. Sometimes you can just not manage to recruit the right numbers. But given what we know about the budget going forward, we have to be really prudent in the number of police officers that we're recruiting at the moment. Because as Linda said, you just cannot keep recruiting at a certain level and then suddenly, well you could, but I don't think it would be good for the organisation, suddenly turn off the tap and just fall. You've also got the fact that once you've recruited a police officer, they could be with you for 30 years. So you can't just make police officers redundant and manage your workforce in that way. So there are really difficult challenges around managing a workforce, keeping recruitment levels high, but keeping that recruitment level, managing going forward, knowing that we've got some really significant savings we've got to find. And as we've been very, the Mayor and myself are very clear that actually when it comes to it, you're going to have to go into, if we don't get the money we are lobbying government for, and if we do have to enact some of the scenarios, I really hope we don't have to enact police officer numbers, we are going to be really challenged in keeping police officer numbers up to the level that we would wish them to have. So it's in terms of the planning, we're looking at different scenarios and they have different numbers of police officers in. We're lobbying in the meantime incredibly hard. I hope you'll join us in lobbying for making sure that London gets its fair share. No funding formula, back to the discussions we've had.
Your recruitment, if your natural wastage is 1,600 to 1,800 a year, so are you looking at recruiting about 1,800 a year to sort of stand still? What's your sort of figure at the moment, or how many are you hoping to recruit this year?
At the moment, in the budget, we have enough money for 31,200. The recruitment, we continue to try to recruit. There have been, as papers I think which have been published today or Friday show, there has been some difficulties around the level of recruitment and people coming for, that's what you're referring to. But we are scenario planning because of the budget challenges. we're going to have real difficulties in keeping officer numbers as high as we would want.
So you're looking at around 1,600 to 1,800 new recruits to keep at that level?
If you were staying exactly where we were now, and all other things being equal, and we're not in, there are also some slight cycles in there, but over the years they don't bear it out. So sometimes it will go up to 1,900, sometimes it'll be as low as 1,400.
Okay. And then my final question, not on police officers, is station closures. The Mayor has stated we might see half of all stations closed. Are we likely to see more police station closures as part of your saving plans? I was thinking maybe...
Deputy Mayor, would you want me to...
If we don't, you know, yes, I mean, the Mayor has said that in terms of police stations. We know we've got to make significant savings, and we are, you know, we're looking at, as you'd expect, we're looking at the number of Metropolitan police buildings we have, and we are, you know, we will have to look at whether we can maintain the number of police stations and front counters that there are at present, and whether that's possible. If we don't, you know, the budget is so challenging, we are looking at, you know, significant reductions in the number of front counters.
Yeah. So that's work you're doing at the moment?
Yeah. So again, it's modelling, and it models a range of scenarios. You'll remember, go back to the financial strategy, which is held, again, it'll be reviewed, but it's held for the last few years. We talked about getting back office costs to about 15%. You can do the arithmetic, you can work out that means you've got to spend considerably less on estates and buildings.
Okay, thank you very much.
Every member Prince, and then we're going to move on.
Thank you. A couple of questions, if I may. Firstly, to the Deputy Mayor, if I may. When the Mayor announced he was taking £38 million out of the policing wage budget, he said that that was a one-off saving because he knew that within this 12-month period, he would not be able to recruit up to the 32,000. If it's the case that it was a one-off saving, why are we not talking about the police numbers going back up to 32,000 if we get a reasonable settlement from the government? Or are we now just taking that money and then removing more money from the budget?
When the £38 million was taken out of the budget, taken out, that was a recognition of the level of police officers that that was there.
Yeah.
In terms of what will happen going forward, it's coming back to our scenario planning. We are lobbying really hard to try to get the right amount of money into the Metropolitan Police so we can keep officers' numbers as high as possible. So, and as I've said before, in terms of recruitment, you can't just recruit, keep recruitment really, really high when you know these budget cuts are coming, because you will destabilise recruitment, you'll destabilise the Metropolitan Police. It's just not a good way of managing recruitment.
So are you agreeing with what I said, that it was a one-off saving of 38 million? And if that is the case, as the Mayor said it was, if the police were to receive parity on funding, would we go back to 32,000?
If, in terms of, do you want to, in terms of the...
Just as a process point, this is really early in the budget setting process, so we can't sit here and answer questions about what budget will be set for next year. So we can't say it's one-off or it's
no.
It's
I'm not asking. The reason I'm not asking you,
we are very early in the
Siobhan,
process.
is because this is a political question. The Mayor said that it was a one-off £38 million, recognising, and I accept the argument that we weren't going to get back up to 32,000, but he said that was still, I think he uses the word aspiration now rather than target. But my question to you, if it was a one-off saving and we do get a settlement which is the same as it was last year, so no change, and I suspect we may get to that position, will that £38 million be put back into the budget as the Mayor said he would?
Maintaining at the moment, given our aspiration is to have a strategic target of 32,000 police officers. We're not moving from that. We are lobbying very hard on the police budget. If we don't get what London needs, as we've said already, there's going to be significant problems around police officer numbers, and we know that police officer numbers are going to have to decrease.
So, just for clarity, Sophie, if we get the same amount of money in the forthcoming year as we had last year, will you again work towards 32,000?
We're trying to build our budget at the moment. If we have the same amount of money as we had last year, we will not be able to recruit 32,000 police officers because the same amount of money is not enough.
But that's not what the Mayor said, though, was it? He said it was a one-off saving. And
he said he's maintaining the strategic target of 32,000. There's a one-off saving recognising the actual recruited number of police officers that we had at the moment.
Exactly.
That's what he said.
Which therefore implies that going forward, that money could be put back in because we would be able to recruit the extra officers.
We're lobbying really hard to get the right amount of money for London. We're maintaining the strategic target, but we're also realistic. You know, we have to be prudent in our scenario planning and in our recruitment. And until we know that we're getting any extra money,
I understand that, Sophie,
that's
but I'm
the
just
position
saying,
we're in.
in theory, if you were to get the same amount of money as you had this year, next year, would you reinstate up to 32,000? Simple yes or no, Sophie.
We don't have the money, and this is the issue, isn't it, of the budget. We have a strategic target. We know what the money that is coming in. We, you know, in the budget, there is not enough money, and this is the whole point, to maintain police officer numbers at the level we would wish.
So it wasn't a one-off based on it?
We're building the budget at the moment, and we're lobbying very hard.
All right, okay, thank you. So we're at if this is a question for Mr. Mackey. We're at 31,200, something like that at the moment. You're now planning to get it down to around about 30,000, you're saying, possibly, in the event of, yeah. I'm sure you have a much better grasp of maths than a certain shadow Home Secretary. How much money would we save by reducing the police officers by 1,000?
Well, you save about, the unit cost that we work on very roughly is about £53,000 per person. It's actually somewhere between 53 and 55.
It's not £30, obviously.
People will quote all sorts of figures. That's what we work on for London, around it. So that's the sort. Those are the sorts of sums. So our annual turnover each year, it gives you very roughly about 100 million of swing space in terms of that's the sort of budget figure.
Okay, that's very helpful, thank you.
So that's the one. When we talk about that, we talk slightly less for police staff, don't we? I think we model at about 50 for police staff, don't we? Yes.
Okay, one final tidy up question, then we're going to talk about frontline policing. The IT strategy, the digital mobility aspect of that, when you appeared in January, you said that if you get that right, it would free up between 400 and 800 police officer annual hours worth of time.
Yeah.
Does that still stand in light of what we heard earlier about the digital strategy?
Oh, so that bit, yes. So the digital, and please, by all means, come and see it. It started the rollout. We've spoken before here. I think there's some real successes that have gone uncelebrated. So the rollout of body-worn video. I mean, that digital team have rolled out body-worn video, and that's a really good example of how you have to be flexible and change your position. So when we first talked about body-worn video, we were going to store all that data ourselves with all the costs associated with that. That's now in a cloud-based solution in terms of doing it, and we've rolled out, and we are the largest rollout of body-worn video in the world. There is no one bigger in terms of the work doing around body-worn video. The mobility has started, so you'll see various people with tablets. I mean, we could have, we stuck to paper today, but we certainly for internal meetings, we've moved to it's all tablet-based with remote access. So you remember last time you spoke to me a lot about Windows XP, that solves the Windows XP challenge as part of that world. A little aside, but again quite unsung in terms of what it's done, the move to a new internet presence for the Met. There's a conversation going on at the moment whether the solution that's been developed in London will be the national solution for policing. So we are moving forward at a pace in that space. You know, colleagues from HMIC who've just been with us said there's some quite exciting stuff going on there.
So you're happy to stand by the 400 to 800?
Yes, give me that, and the other one I want is MIPS. So if I can have two things while I'm on a roll, I want the replacement of the core systems. Because the thing that worries me that I can't cost, and we've seen it in other parts of the private sector recently, is the challenge of obsolescent systems. So I want to do that replacement of those core systems. Then I think there's about 700 to 800 worth of people, time you can take out.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Deval.
We prefer the word redeploy.
Sorry?
We prefer the word redeploy.
Well, redeploy, yeah. But I'm just being realistic about where it might be, depending on the scenarios. No, I mean, we're absolutely clear. So the board's strategic intention, we wanted to make these efficiencies so we could free up 1,000 officers to redeploy to priorities.
Okay, so this section's on frontline policing, and it's down to me to lead off. I've got a number of set questions here, and then there's a bit where I'm going to go, whatever it is, off-piste. Freestyle.
That's the scary bit.
So for the general starter, so Craig, you mentioned earlier on the real issue about numbers is about the police's ability to operate and to respond to issues and meet the challenges in policing London. You said later on about that there's a 5% turnover. Is it, just to paint a picture for this committee, the 5% turnover, are they experience rich, the people that leave the Met by and large? And are you still managing and grappling with a fairly young service still? Or is that not the case? Where are we in that? Give us a picture.
Of course I can. If I may, it's more nuanced than that. So each month that people board, which is one of the internal boards in the organisation, we look at exit and leavers, and leavers as in terms of people leaving the organisation, not leavers you can pull, reasons, rationale and age and service profile in terms of where people are going. I say the turnover is about 5% for the organisation. To put that in perspective, we think the Ministry of Defence run at about 10%, so our turnover is relatively low. But it's nothing to be complacent about. When we look at the reasons people are leaving when they're leaving either mid-career, we thought we'd see more about things like changes in terms and conditions. Some of it's about things like work-life balance and some of those sorts of things and the struggle about getting those right. There's quite a lot of noise in the system. There's a real belief, if you look on some of our bulletin boards and forums, that lots of people in mid-service are leaving. That's not borne out by the figures yet. There are some examples of it, particularly where those people feel that they've been particularly adversely affected by some of the national changes in terms and conditions. So that's what's happening in the organisation. The pinch points are bringing people through with investigative skills, so make people who want to go on to be detectives. That's one of the pinch points in the organisation. That's what's happening around most of the movement around people.
Okay, and in the worst case scenario that we face, and we've talked about the numbers issue, the way that we'll see any police cuts in numbers, if that's the case, will be through that wiggle room that you have. It'll be through natural wastage, those issues.
As the Deputy Mayor said, there is no provision for redundancy for police officers. Currently, in the way it's structured, the way it's done under regulations, there is no, so you'd have to do it by natural turnover. You'll remember when we started this process, sort of back in 2012, one of the things we said, and I think we try and do it even now, is to try and create enough headroom to keep people coming into the organisation. Some of the lessons certainly I'd learned from working outside London and had seen the scenario of happened in other places. If you have an organisation the size of the Met, and let's paint a horrible, you do 3 or 4 years with no recruitment, that's actually a really, really big issue. Because you effectively sort of ossify part of the organisation. Now, the plus side, when you look at some of the skills, experience and new Londoners coming in, it brings a vitality to the organisation. But for some of the boroughs, that means that they've got a high percentage of young in service, not necessarily young in experience.
Okay. The recent Times story that, I don't know if you read, Times newspaper recently claimed that you're going to be forced to remove up to 4,000 officers for a recruitment freeze. Was that on the worst case scenario of 6%?
It could be. I don't recognise the 4,000 recruitment freeze figure.
13,000. It was a range between I think your police figures were 4,000 and the Met's was 13,000 and somewhere in between.
No, I mean...
I think they may be over a number of years.
Yeah, and as Linda just whispered, we try not to have a recruitment freeze. So we've always been, in the same way throughout the last 4 or 5 years, we've tried to run promotion processes. I think it's just genuinely quite healthy for the organisation.
Okay, let's move on to the specialist crime then. In terms of the savings and some of the issues that's been covered, I think it has coverage within the press again. It talks about 9.3 million removing from the specialist crime department for policing at a time when I think you are experiencing some difficulties there in fulfilling some of the functions.
Yeah.
What's the story behind that 9.3 million in terms of that, when you've got these backlogs and shortages?
Yeah, you're going to have to help me. Is that one of the scenarios you've been given? That's why I was looking a bit blank.
No, in your revised savings and efficiency plan details a reduction of 9.3 million to police staff in specialist crime operations,
yes.
as well as, I've misread it, on territorial policing.
Yes.
Or is along with,
yeah.
This is the way, this is one of our formal questions we just want to put on record, we want to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, no, sorry, in fairness, those are police staff posts. So we talked about some of the efficiencies we can generate by both the delivery of systems and doing things differently. Those were not police officer posts.
Now, you talked earlier on about reflecting on reversal of cuts. Do you know what I mean? I've been in local government where we've made cuts and sometimes reversed because we've seen the consequence of that. Is there any area in terms of staffing support where you thought that actually maybe you got it wrong?
Gosh.
And that you would want to reverse it if resources allowed it?
Yeah, well, I mean, overtime's a good example where we did. You know, I think when we were first given the challenge of overtime, people said you'll never get it to move. And in fairness, a lot of people did an awful lot of hard work, and it moved. But we reached a point where we said, operationally, particularly around some of the high-profile things, we want to put more back in. And I think that's very real. We do it across a number of areas we look at. So one of the other areas, if you talk particularly, and you'll probably pick this up from boroughs, people would talk about the role of analysts. Have we got that service right? So part of the work we're doing is looking at whether we've got that service right. Is that something about our inability sometimes to define the service, i.e. what the services we want, or is it as basic as we haven't got enough bodies doing it? So no, we do constantly look at those. And that's why the budget process can't be seen outside either the police and crime plan or the operational planning. Because clearly you've got to, over the coming 3 to 5 years, we've got to make sure the resources can flex to whatever the threat is. Because if we end up with a scenario where we have such specialist ring-fence resources that you've effectively got to restructure the organisation every time the threat changes, you'd probably say you haven't got that right.
Okay. And then earlier on I alluded to and about management style interventionists taking responsibility at what various levels of the Met. And then we come back, and I think we've raised this and we've had a conversation, I think, about actually the Met centralisation development, the command and control. I can understand for operational issues, but what about the devolved issues around some of the decision making relating to budgets? Where are we on that thinking inside the Met?
Well, I think...
And do you think it... I mean, personally, you've now had it, you've been outside the Met, you've seen it there. It is slightly different from outside. Is it over-centralised, or is it about right for what the challenges we face?
There's both a sort of a philosophical point in there, and there's a practical point in terms of the response to it. So I think we're on a journey of things during round one where we brought a lot of services into central to gain control and drive cost out and standardise. I think what you're seeing now is a move of predominantly the control of and the access to the money going back out. So I think with the work around the BCU models, the work around the hubs in specialist crime, that is around trying to give leaders at the appropriate level, there you go, that's your service, there's the money that goes with it, within these parameters, run it and make it work. So I think you are seeing a move that's quite natural, almost in the evolution of how this works. The new commissioner, you know, Cressida, she's very strong on making sure we empower people and allow them to make decisions, hold them to account for it, but empower them, allow them to make decisions and give them the freedom to do it. And that was, when we talked about these new BCU roles and the BCU commanders, that was very much part of why we were doing it. To say, you know, it's at a sizable level, that's the freedom you're being given for it.
Okay. And just, again, belongs to the formal questions. So, on the funding allocated to the Mayor's pan-London-wide priorities and local priorities decided by borough county, how is that? Is that decided by local borough commanders, or is that somewhere in TP, higher up with Martin and co? At what levels will the budgets be considered for what's happening within the borough territorial policing? How is that funding allocated?
Right, so are we talking about the what I would call core funding, so the funding for people?
Well, I suppose the pan-London priorities that arise from the community safety plan would be that, but yeah, you'd be looking at it from that about people and about how money is allocated to the boroughs and who's involved and how's that.
Right, so when the TP budget holder is Martin, so Martin is the TP budget holder. Below the level below that, it goes down to so you can work out what's on each. But the budget is structural. It's how many people are in it. It's what buildings they've got. It's what support costs. It's structural rather than here's 15 million for knife crime in this borough. The budget is structural. The service delivery is different.
And when do they merge then? And when do they merge? And isn't that the new dynamic we need in terms of to deliver the London safety plan?
It is, but they merge in the tasking and deployment. So that's where they merge. You know, as the Deputy Mayor touched, if you had less money, you'd probably take longer to either do the priorities, or there'd only be 3 priorities rather than 5. That's where they merge. So they merge in terms of what you do, how you deploy the asset, what focus you put to it, and that's where, and I know you haven't seen it yet, I think the plan is hopefully after this, so that's why our business plan goes through those sorts of details in terms of doing it.
And it then does beg the questions about the implications about future abstractions and the policy that the Met operate. Light touch, heavy touch. Is there sensitivities about there is a job of work to be done down on territorial policing as much there's a job of work in terms of supporting central London on its day-to-day activities?
I think people are very aware of that, and if you'd have been party to any of the groups, the dynamic planning we've done for the last 12 weeks with these incidents, there is always a conversation around what is the impact. However bad the atrocity is, what is the impact on what we're doing across the rest of London? So we made a conscious decision on both Westminster and on London Bridge. We did not move territorial policing straight to 12-hour shifts.
Okay, so
entirely for the reasons we know if you do things like that, realistically for an organisation even of our size, you can do that for about 4 or 5 days. The organisation then starts to feel quite ragged.
Okay, so that's times of woe.
Yeah.
Right, and actually there are times on normal abstraction and in terms of on standby that also takes its toll on certain boroughs and the contributions they have to make.
Yeah.
And is there a common sense approach around that on these occasions, or when there might well be pressures back in boroughs or back whatever we're going to call the new operational units?
And that
areas.
Those are the sort of conversations that we're party to most days of the week. So if you'd see Martin Hewitt and Pat Gallard in the specialist area, with Mark in the SO area, it will be, let's say, a particular area. Let's say Greenwich. Look, Greenwich is under a lot of pressure at the moment. There's this and this. Can we reduce the abstractions on there, take them elsewhere, or do we really need to do the abstractions in that way? That's the sort of management, and particularly at the DAC level, that's going on all the time.
Okay. I now want to move on to borough mergers. This will be the 5th meeting, I think, since the new administration, on top of the previous meetings in the old administration where I've asked questions about this. And we're heading towards an implementation date. And, you know, quite frankly, I understand why we're doing it. I'm going to ask you some questions about the savings and about new ways of working. But I am becoming very sceptical about some of the provision of information that you in the police are providing those in boroughs and about some of the process. So let's just go back in terms of the checks and balances as you move towards implementation. Will the Pathfinder pilots pass their MPS evaluation stage? And I know they're being evaluated in August, but you've got some information now, and presumably, hopefully, people made some changes if something was going wrong or not quite right, and that's going to be all there. But if you're implementing in the autumn, isn't August a bit rather last minute in terms of the approach? Tell me about that.
I'm sure the Deputy Mayor will want to come in terms of some of the detail about when decisions may or may not be taken. But the reality is, you can do an evaluation very, very quickly if you want to, and you'd quite rightly say to me, hang on a minute, they've been running for 2 months in their full run out, you haven't got enough data, you haven't got enough to, I want longer. So you always push up against timelines in terms of doing it. So August realistically is when you get the full set of the opportunity to look at the full set of data. Yes, are they changing as we go forward? Yes, and are we learning things? Absolutely. That was the whole purpose of doing the Pathfinders.
And in that sense, that's the evaluation for that. But also, I've noticed I come across the document of the overview of the investment appraisal programme, because actually you could argue that it's not all doom and gloom on borough measures. There is an investment process. Yep. So is that different evaluation process, this document, which goes through, summarises the key stages and gates and relevant business cases being done for this project?
Yes, there is a proper business case.
And will they be available, not so much for this committee, but I think it might be interesting because the finances we're going to ask, because I'm quite interested about the finances, but also for the Police and Crime Committee then, that we can have access to those various processes as it's gone through, to see whether it's, you know, in terms of its evaluation, in terms of the implementation of it.
I mean, they'll go through the Deputy Mayor, I'm assuming they're...
And so are we on course for autumn implementation then? Are we still... is that the political decision or the Met decision? Which is which?
The evaluation of the Pathfinders is, you know, there's ongoing. They're looking at what is happening at the moment, taking, you know, going through some teething issues and some, you know, issues that have been bubbling up. There has not yet been a proper evaluation. Until we have properly evaluated, we don't know what pathway we are on. We have to make sure that there is and this is why we've done a Pathfinder. Got to learn the lessons, make sure that we're, you know, got a realistic implementation plan. That isn't necessary from 2 Pathfinders to the whole of London. What is realistic, what's achievable, and what are the lessons that we can learn from the Pathfinder? And when we've learnt the lessons, we'll go to an implementation plan. But as I said, that's not necessarily from 2 to 32, you know, to the whole of London.
So I shouldn't take it that it's autumn then. It could. There's a timeline here somewhere between autumn and whenever.
No, we've got to do proper evaluation. We've got to learn the lessons. There isn't a set pathway, which means that we're going to take a decision in September, October, and then it's an implementation. What we all need to do is learn the lessons, do the proper evaluation, because this is really about the service delivery to the public, and we can't risk that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I think that's where we're coming from, and increasingly so, until we can get the confidence of some of the questions we're asking directly of the police. So, and, you know, quite frankly, I do get it. I mean, I still would like to see, and I've yet to see, about the delayering of the rest. You've evaluated those ranks in territorial policing, but I've yet to see whether you've done that same exercise across the Met. About where you have, or you've started.
So some of that work around what models could look like for other bits of the Met, absolutely, and that's all. So there's a lot of work being done in.
There's an equivalent of looking at the ranks, the appropriateness of the ranks, what they do, how they do it, and is
what
it
the workload is, and that's part of the debates for management board as we go through this summer about how far do you want to go, what do you want to do,
Okay,
because all of these are absolutely options to consider.
I think you mentioned before, Craig, when we talked at the very earliest part of this administration about what we thought the savings were. Have we bottomed out what we think the potential or actual savings can be made from the mergers? Have we got the financial
I haven't got the
pace of where that
I
is?
haven't got the figures on me, but in the region of about 50 million, I think.
40
So,
to 50 million.
yeah.
Just by taking out certain ranks, then it must be more than that.
Not just certain areas.
So give us an idea of where those savings, where the big headlines numbers fall in terms of the changes to this operational policing.
I think I'd probably, if I get the figures and provide those to you, I would be guessing in terms of some of those bits, as Craig says, property, etc., etc.
Could you write to the committee and we'll circulate it, please?
And I should ask, that will include property, wouldn't it, in that?
Yes.
So it's, right, okay. And some of the issues that we touched on earlier, Craig, is the borough mergers, and is there a discussion of whether, the analysis for the new operational units, this is the time to rethink, are we over-reliant on, because I think what the police is reliant on now at local level is the boroughs providing some of that analysis, and then what, there's all sorts of conversations about, does this back up what MOPAC say or what the MPS say? Centrally, there isn't a one sort of consistent view. So is this the time to look at that then?
So as part of the budget process this year, there's a number of areas. So what we do is exactly the same as you expect to see elsewhere. We look at benchmarking in terms of what we spend on services, and then look at particular areas to target as part of the budget process, because you can't literally, in an organisation our size, do a sort of line by line of every single budget. You can do some of that, but so one of the areas to look at is intelligence. We spend quite a lot of money that's in a bucket called administration. We want to get a better handle on what we're spending around forensics, because we've got some really quite innovative things being done there. I want to see what costs that will feed into the business model. We spoke before about DP, so there's a number of these that are quite deep in terms of doing it. And it goes back to your earlier point, that doesn't assume, because you're looking at them, you're going to spend less on them. You might, as we did with overtime and others, make a conscious decision that actually, in terms of what matters, i.e. what happens to the people of London, we ought to be spending more on that.
And I suppose on frontline, are we, you've got your plans in terms of property and how you're going to do that. One of the issues that's come back on local policing is that we've now got the local neighbourhood policing spending too much time travelling to their destinations of work. Right, so they're on the buses, which is quite nice visually for those that are doing it. What in terms of these new merged areas, are we still sticking to one base per borough, or are you moving off the one base per borough? What is the issue, and how are we going to solve that we get the maximum hours of work out of the local police and they're not spending their time? Because you can spend up to an hour in some cases in some of our boroughs, travelling from one part to the other part of the borough, unless you're going to put them back in cars, unless they're back out on bicycles. I don't see many of those now. So what's the thinking around that? I mean,
there are quite a lot of bicycles in and around the centre of London, if you see them, so it's not completely gone. So how many buildings, what they're like, what the footprint is absolutely part of the debate in the estate strategy in terms of the work around it. Even down to, and if Martin Hewitt was here, he'd talk about some of the advanced conversations about should we be working out of other buildings as well, so the sharing issue. I don't know the detail enough in Greenwich, but if I think of some of the other boroughs where we've already had discussions around why can't the neighbourhood team work out of X or Y. So I think there are a whole range of potential solutions, and it won't be a one-size-fits-all. I'd be surprised, given the very different nature of the 32 London boroughs and the PCU groupings. So I think you'll see that emerge as we go through the summer. You can be more aggressive on estates if you want to be, but you may have some of those disincentives of travel time and those sorts of things. But if you don't take money on estates, you've got to take it somewhere else if we get some of the more challenging scenarios.
Okay. Have we come up with a name? I know it's a BCU to generic. Have we come up with a name then for these merged boroughs? Area 51, something like that.
That's the most
We're going down the French system.
Yeah, I was
precinct
yeah,
13.
I was prepared for every other question, not that one.
They're called East and North at the moment. aren't
Yeah,
they?
east and north at the moment, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, members. Thank you to our guests as well. That draws the discussion to a close. Can I thank you all very much for your time and for your answers. Members, we will be revisiting this subject at our next meeting alongside the Mayor's budget guidance in July, and potentially the funding formula will be known by then, but it may not be. So can we note the answers given to the questions asked? Item 9, members, is the Budget and Performance Committee work programme, which is listed in your papers. Can we agree the work programme from September 2017 for the remainder of the year? Thank you. Can we delegate authority to me in consultation with group lead members in the usual way to agree the topic for the meeting of the Budget Monitoring Subcommittee on the 12th of July? Thank you. Date of the next meeting is 19th of July at 10 o'clock in here. There isn't any other urgent business, so the meeting is closed. Thank you.
GLA Chamber Sound. 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 GLA Chamber Sound.